I only needed shelter, but this forgotten loft already knew my family.
She was 25 and ruined, no office, no references, no suitcase, just a cracked leather portfolio and $4 she had folded flat beneath the lining after selling her last clean blouse. And with that $4, she bought a loft above a fish market in Gloucester, Essex County, Massachusetts, on a wharf spur that had fallen off the city fire maps in 1938. One wall leaned 3 inches toward the harbour, rain came through a roof seam above the stairwell. The county had condemned it since 1981 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the loft's highest shelf, behind a hand-worn strip of pine in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Isla Mae Vane had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she waited beside windows, beside sinks, beside the locked door of her father's drafting room, listening for the careful scrape of his chair across the floor. She grew up in a narrow rented house outside New Bedford, where the air carried diesel from the harbour and the sweet rot of eelgrass whenever the tide ran low. Her father, Elias Vane, worked with a pencil as if it were a blade he had to keep honest. He drew hull fittings, ballast systems, pulley housings, stabilizing fins, all the unseen bones that helped vessels move through weather without wasting strength. Isla did not understand the drawings at first. They looked like churches laid on their sides, all arches and measured emptiness, but she understood the way her father handled paper. He never slapped a plan down. He laid it flat with both hands, smoothing the corners as if apology and precision belonged to the same family. Her mother, Marianne, was a woman of folded laundry and sealed envelopes. Handsome in a still way, with amber hair, she pinned too tightly, and a voice that never rose when disappointment would do. She worked at a dental office and kept the house in a condition of polished restraint. There were no extra cushions, no second helpings left in bowls, no photographs on the refrigerator. A person could live there for a month and not know that joy had ever been expected. Still, there were evenings when Elias took Isla to the harbour after supper and let her sit on the cold stone edge while he named the working boats by their wake. He taught her that every line had a reason. A mast leaned because wind made demands. A bow curved because water punished bluntness. A rope was not merely tied, it was asked to remember. When Isla was 7, he gave her a ruler of yellowed boxwood and a magnifying glass in a brass frame. Care is a form of courage, he told her, and then drew a circle so fine it seemed less made than discovered. She kept both objects in the bottom drawer of her desk until the day the drawer was no longer hers. The person who gave shape to Isla's patience, though, was not her father. It was his uncle, Silas Vane, a retired sailmaker and bottle ship builder who lived in a rented upstairs room behind a chandlery near the old waterfront. Silas had hands that looked wrecked by weather, but they moved with a tenderness that made fragile things obedient. His left thumb had been flattened by a block-and-tackle accident in 1969, and he used that battered thumb for bracing matchstick masts, while he shaved them with a penknife no longer than a child's finger. Every Saturday, after the market closed and the last gulls began to quarrel over fish heads in the alley, Elias would walk Isla to Silas's room. The ritual never changed. Silas opened the door with a kettle already singing. He made weak black tea for himself, milk with 1 spoon of honey for Isla, and placed 3 tools on the table before anything was said, tweezers, awl, knife. Then came a saucer of beeswax, a coil of thread, a paper packet of matchsticks, and 1 empty bottle washed until the glass carried no memory of what it had held. The room smelled of rope tar, orange peels, old varnish, and pipe smoke left behind in the curtains from years before he quit. On the windowsill sat 6 finished ships, each one built outside the bottle, folded down flat by hidden hinges, then raised inside with long threads pulled through the narrow neck. To Isla they looked impossible. To Silas, impossibility was only impatience wearing a costume. He taught her to split a matchstick along the grain with 1 slow pressure of the blade. He taught her how to drag thread across beeswax until it darkened and stiffened, how to make a knot so compact it did not look like a knot at all. He made her practice tying ratlines between two pins stuck into cork. He made her take them apart and do them again if one ladder rung sagged. "Do not punish the material," he said when she pressed too hard. "Invite it." Those words stayed. They did not mean gentleness for the sake of gentleness. They meant that every honest thing had a nature, and the work was to find it before forcing it to become useful. Wood split if hurried, thread snarled if insulted, glass kept every fingerprint. A person, too, could be mishandled into silence. By the time Isla was 12, she could rig a 3-masted schooner inside a medicine bottle without breaking a spar. By 15, she knew how to hide a folded sail beneath a deckhouse and raise it with horsehair so fine it nearly vanished. Silas never praised her loudly. He would set the finished bottle on the sill, turn it once toward the light, and nod as if something private had been confirmed. Then Elias died in February, in a cold rain that made the hospital windows look like melting slate. A blood vessel in his brain had opened without warning while he was carrying groceries from the car. He was 46. The house filled briefly with casseroles, legal papers, murmured sentences, and men from work who stood near the doorway holding their hats. Afterward, the rooms seemed to have lost their corners. Silas came every evening for 13 days. He washed dishes without being asked. He sat beside Isla without filling the silence. On the last night he brought a square wooden chest with brass corners and set it at her feet. Inside were her father's first compass, 2 notebooks of design calculations, the brass magnifying glass, and a wrapped bundle Isla was told not to open until she had a room of her own. But grief makes property vulnerable. Within a year, Marianne married Victor Hallow, a maritime licensing consultant with a clean jaw, lacquered shoes, and a smell of bay rum that entered a room ahead of him. Victor was not loud. Loudness would have made him easier to name. He moved through the Vane house as a man corrects a ledger, identifying redundancies and removing them. The chest went first to the basement, then to a storage unit. Then, after one winter storm flooded the lower level, it disappeared into the sentence, "I'm afraid it was already damaged." Silas's visits became less convenient. Victor preferred weekends without harbour talk. Mariana began standing between the old man and the door with her hands folded, smiling in a way that closed the house. Silas died when Isla was 18. His room was cleared before she arrived from community college. The chandlery owner handed her one paper bag containing a chipped mug, 3 unlabelled photographs, and the penknife with the short blade wrapped in cloth. The unfinished bottles, the tweezers, the awls, the wax, the ledgers of miniature plans, all of it had been taken by a distant cousin or thrown out by a landlord who needed the room empty by Monday. Nobody knew which. Nobody asked twice. Isla carried that paper bag back on the bus with both hands around it, as if pressure could keep loss from spilling. At home, Victor looked at the penknife and said relics made young people sentimental, and sentiment made them poor. Mariana stirred soup at the stove and did not turn. For a while Isla answered the world in the only language that had not abandoned her. She studied marine systems design at night and worked at a repair yard by day, cataloguing fittings, drafting revised mounts, learning software from borrowed manuals. She ate rice from chipped bowls and taped engineering formulas above her bed. She rebuilt her father's notebooks from memory where she could, and where she could not, she built new ones. That was how she met Graham Reed. He was older by 9 years, handsome in the bright, easy manner of men who expect every door to recognize them. Graham had money from an uncle, contacts from a business program, and a talent for saying another person's idea back to them in a way that made it sound freshly his. He found Isla at a regional innovation workshop, where she presented a low-profile stabilizer assembly meant for mid-sized fishing vessels working rough water on limited fuel. The design came from years of watching boats labour against weather from her father's old principles, and from her own exact revisions made at kitchen tables and public terminals. Graham called it elegant. He called it viable. He called it the kind of thing investors could understand if someone translated it properly. Together they formed a small company in Providence. Isla brought the drawings, the prototype models, the test data, the patient hours. Graham brought suits, meetings, introductions, rooms with glass walls, and the bright vocabulary of growth. At first, she believed usefulness had finally found a door. She worked through nights, slept under her desk, corrected every tolerance, rewrote filings, made the design honest enough to survive manufacture. Then the documents changed. Her name moved from founder to consultant, then from consultant to former contractor. Version numbers disappeared from shared folders. Patent language bent until her original designs wore Graham's signature. When she objected, he smiled with a tired kindness that frightened her more than anger would have done. Investors stopped answering her messages. A rumor began, precise enough to wound and vague enough to travel, that she had falsified test results and mishandled company funds. By September, the office badge no longer opened a door. By October, the company website had been scrubbed clean of her. The design she had made was announced under a new name at a small maritime technology conference, with Graham standing beside a prototype whose internal geometry still carried the habits of her hand. She did not confront him after that. There are people who feed on the heat of protest. Isla had only cold left. On October 17th, 2022, the eviction came at 8:10 in the morning. Rain needled the hallway windows of the Providence apartment building, and the radiator clanked as if protesting after the decision had already been made. The officer held a clipboard sealed in a plastic sleeve. The landlord's son stood behind him in a puffer jacket, chewing gum with his mouth closed. Victor was there because the lease had once carried his guarantee, and Marianne was there because silence had become her preferred signature. Isla had packed 2 cardboard boxes, but only one was allowed into her arms when the time shortened. The physical thing she reached for was the cracked leather portfolio under the bed, its seams whitened, its clasp repaired with thread. Inside were copies of drawings, rejection letters, 3 photographs of her father, Silas's penknife wrapped in cloth, and the boxwood ruler worn smooth at one end. Victor picked up the second box, the one with books and winter socks, and placed it beside the door as if staging evidence. You cannot keep what was never yours. Isla. 8 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Mariana stood by the stairwell in a camel-coloured coat, one hand at her throat, her wedding ring catching the grey light. For half a breath, Isla looked at her mother and waited for the smallest movement, a step forward, a hand extended, even the old word daughter spoken without performance. Mariana lowered her eyes to the wet floorboards. That was all. Isla walked out with the portfolio pressed against her ribs, and the $4 hidden in the lining, though she did not remember putting the bills there. The door closed behind her with the modest sound of a thing completing its work. The first week she slept in Providence Station, upright on a bench near the vending machines, waking whenever the security guard's shoes changed direction. She washed in the restroom before dawn, using brown paper towels and cold water that smelled faintly of copper. She applied for jobs from library computers until each application box seemed to have been built with Graham's rumour already inside it. Marine firms did not reply. Drafting offices replied once, then vanished. A boatyard supervisor in Fall River took her resume, recognized the company name, and gave it back too carefully. The second week she rode a bus to Boston because larger cities give despair more corners to stand in. She slept 2 nights in South Station, 1 night in a church basement in Back Bay, and 4 nights on a cot in a shelter where the blankets were washed thin, and the woman beside her counted prayers on her fingers until morning. Her money went from $4 to $3.12, then to $1.63 after crackers, a comb, and a cup of coffee she bought, not for thirst, but for the right to sit near heat. She sold her phone in Cambridge for $20 cash and immediately regretted the relief of it. Without it, the world grew slower and more honest, but also harder to enter. She wrote email addresses on the back of rejection letters. She kept bus routes in her head. She learned which library branches allowed longer computer sessions, which grocery stores marked down bread after 6, which train bathrooms had warm water. By the 3rd week, she was in Worcester, sleeping beneath the overhang of an insurance office until a patrol car idled too long at the curb. By the 4th, she had reached Lowell, where an outreach worker named Mrs. Keene gave her wool socks, a granola bar, and the address of a day centre. Isla kept the wrapper from the granola bar because it was clean and silver inside. She used it as a mirror to pin back her hair. In Salem, she slept one night behind a closed tourist kiosk, hearing laughter from restaurants bright with people who had chosen their hunger. In Lynn, she spent a day in a laundromat without washing anything, hands folded over the leather portfolio while dryers turned like portholes beside her. In Peabody, a diner owner let her sit through a sleet storm after buying only tea, then quietly placed a bowl of clam chowder near her elbow and walked away before gratitude could embarrass them both. 6 weeks can make a person less visible. Isla's coat lost a button, her shoes opened at the sides, her face sharpened in the window glass of buses and public doors. She learned to take up less space, to move before being asked, to sleep lightly, to keep one hand through the portfolio strap. Every morning she folded the previous day into herself and kept walking. The classified ad appeared on a Tuesday in the Gloucester Public Library, though she had gone inside only because the wind off the harbour had teeth that day. The building was warm in the grave, generous way of public places that have sheltered generations without asking for proof of deserving. There were old men reading newspapers on wooden sticks, a mother whispering over picture books, and a librarian with silver hair pushing a cart of returns as carefully as a nurse. Isla sat at a computer near the back wall and searched for work until the screen blurred. Then, while waiting for a page to load, she noticed a corkboard beside the stairwell. It held notices for piano lessons, snow shoveling, a missing orange cat, estate cleanouts, church suppers, and one county posting printed on pale yellow paper curled at the corners. Condemned loft structure over former fish stall. Wharf spur 3. Gloucester. Tax forfeit transfer. $4 administrative consideration. Buyer assumes all liability. Back fees waived upon recorded occupancy. No utilities guaranteed. No warranty of habitability. Demolition pending. Someone had underlined demolition pending in pencil. Someone else had written, in a different hand, not worth it. Isla read the notice 3 times. The price was not a price. It was a warning wearing a number. $4 did not buy shelter. $4 bought risk. Mildew, rot, unpaid weather, and the right to be blamed when a condemned wall obeyed gravity. Yet the words former fish stall held her in place. So did Gloucester. So did Loft. She went to the reference desk and asked where the county offices were. The librarian looked at Isla's coat, the cracked portfolio, the shoes, then the paper in her hand. She did not pity her aloud. She drew a map on scrap paper, marked 2 turns, and said the clerk's office closed at 4:30. Outside, the harbour was lowering itself into afternoon. Nets hung stiff along a fence. A gull stood on one leg atop a piling, its feathers ruffled by wind. The smell of salt and fish and diesel came through the street with such force that Isla had to stop and take it in. It was not pleasant. It was not clean, but it was real, and reality, after weeks of rumour and closed doors, had the rough mercy of something that did not pretend. She unfolded the hidden bills beneath the lining of the portfolio. 4 singles, soft as cloth from being carried too long. She smoothed them against the library wall and counted them once. Then Isla Mae Vane, who had lost an office, a name, a house, and nearly the last proof of her own work, began walking toward the county clerk with the slow, deliberate care of a person carrying everything she had left in one hand. The county office sat uphill from the harbour in a brick municipal building with greenish windows, and by the time Isla reached it, her fingers had gone pale around the strap of the portfolio. The wind had followed her from the library, shoving bits of paper along the gutter, lifting the ends of her coat, carrying the harbour into every open seam of the town. Gloucester did not smell like a postcard in late November. It smelled of bait barrels, wet rope, diesel exhaust, fried onions from a lunch counter, and the cold mineral breath of water that had taken men for centuries and returned only some of them. She climbed the front steps slowly, not because they were steep, but because she had learned over the last weeks that warm buildings could change their minds. A person might be welcome for 10 minutes and watched by the 11th. A person might be invisible until she became inconvenient. The brass handle of the county door was clean from many hands. She held it with 2 fingers, pulled and entered into a vestibule where a rubber mat held grey puddles shaped like islands. Inside the building carried the settled odour of paper, floor wax, damp wool and old heat. Fluorescent lights hummed above framed maps of wards and precincts. A bulletin board listed shellfish closures, zoning hearings, voter deadlines, and one notice about snow emergency parking. Down the hall, a clock ticked too loudly, each second dropping into the place with official patience. The clerk's office was behind a half-glass door painted cream. Gold letters flaked at the edges, Essex County Registry Annex. A bell on the door trembled when Isla pushed it open. 3 desks sat inside, but only one was occupied. Behind it, a woman in her late 60s looked up from a stack of folders tied with cotton tape. Her nameplate read MRS. Ada Merrow, County Clerk. Ada Merrow had hair the colour of candle smoke, pinned in a knot that had loosened without surrendering. Her glasses hung from a blue cord against a cardigan patched at both elbows. She wore no makeup except for a little rose colour that had settled into the lines near her mouth, and her hands were square, capable, with short nails and a silver ring worn thin at the palm. On the wall behind her hung a photograph of a fishing schooner under full sail, the print browned by years of county heat. The room was narrow but not unfriendly. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall in alphabetical ranks. A radiator hissed beneath a window looking toward rooftops and a grey slice of harbour. On the counter stood an ink pad, a chained pen, a dish of paper clips, and a brass stamp mounted on a black handle worn smooth by decades of recorded intentions. Ada looked first at Isla's face, then at the notice folded in her hand. "That posting has been up 3 years," she said. Her voice had the dry kindness of someone who would rather be plain than cruel. "I saw it at the library," Isla answered. "Most people do. Most people read the second paragraph and keep walking." Isla placed the notice on the counter and kept her palm over the corner where it curled. "I would like to ask about the transfer." Ada was still for a moment. Outside the office, someone laughed down the hallway. Then a door closed. The clerk opened a drawer, removed a pair of half-moon reading glasses, and put them on as if preparing to examine not a paper, but a wound. "You understand," she said. "There is no plumbing above the first floor." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the electrical service was cut before my granddaughter was born." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the floor framing may not meet present code, past code, or plain sense." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the fish market below has been shuttered since 1998, and the tenant before that left, owing 3 towns and 2 cousins." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the city has no obligation to make it safe for you." "Yes, ma'am." Ada removed her glasses and let them hang again from the blue cord. "And you understand that a deed is not the same as a home?" Isla looked at the brass stamp. It was flecked with black ink at the base, each fleck hardened there by repetition. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk sat back. Her chair gave a faint, complaining sound. "All right," she said, but the words did not yet open anything. "Then we shall be exact." She turned to a computer with a beige keyboard and typed in short, deliberate bursts. The monitor was positioned so Isla could see only a reflection of window light and Ada's moving hands. From a drawer came a file, and from the file came a paper with a blue county seal already printed at the top. Ada read sections aloud, not as ceremony, but as warnings set into language. Tax forfeit structure. Transfer of liability. No representation as to condition. Purchaser assumes occupancy burden. Demolition stay contingent upon recorded personal repair effort within 90 days. Back fees suspended. Not forgiven. Pending review. Isla listened. She had spent months watching words become weapons. These words were not kind, but they were clean. They told her where the edge was. Ada slid a form across the counter. Print your full legal name. The pen was chained to the counter by a beaded metal cord. Isla bent over the paper. The first letter shook and thickened where ink paused. She slowed her hand. Printing a name, after weeks of not being believed, seemed almost immodest. When she finished, Ada turned the form around and studied it. Her eyes stopped. For the first time since Isla had entered, the clerk's face changed. Not much. A slight lifting around the brow. A small recession of breath. She looked from the paper to Isla, then back again. Vane, Ada said. The name sounded different in that room, set down among deeds and plat maps and boundary disputes. Yes. Ada touched the edge of the paper with one finger. Any relation to Silas Vane? Isla's hand tightened on the portfolio strap. The office seemed to reduce itself to the radiator hiss and the hidden tick of the wall clock. He was my great-uncle. Ada remained very still. Then she reached for the photograph of the schooner behind her desk and angled it slightly toward the light, not removing it from the wall. He repaired the rigging on that model when I was 9. Not the real vessel, you understand, the model. My father kept it in the front window of his bait shop. A boy broke the mainmast with a broom handle, and Silas fixed it so clean my father never found the repair. Isla did not trust her voice immediately. You knew him. Everyone near the working harbour knew him, whether they knew it or not. Ada's mouth softened. He could put a ladder of thread where other men could not put a nail. The sentence entered Isla gently and hurt because of it. She looked down at the counter, at the scuffed place where many elbows had waited. He taught me, she said. I wondered. Ada pushed the paper back toward herself. The loft belonged once to men who knew that kind of work. Not lately. Not for a very long while. She did not explain more. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps the county record had only names and dates, not the touch by which work travels from one hand to another. Ada opened another drawer and removed a deed packet, 2 carbon copies, and an envelope already yellowing along the flap. The administrative consideration is due at signing. Isla took the folded bills from the portfolio lining with care. She did not smooth them this time. She laid them on the counter, one by one, and Ada counted them with no expression that could be mistaken for pity. The clerk gave her a receipt. Then she lifted the brass stamp. It struck the paper with a sound deeper than Isla expected. Not loud. Final. The black handle rose and fell again on the duplicate, then on the registry copy. Ada sanded the ink lightly, blew once across the paper, and clipped the packet together with a triangular brass fastener. There, she said. Recorded as of this afternoon. Isla looked at the paper. It did not look like shelter. It looked like any other form, straight-edged and indifferent. Yet it had weight. It had a boundary. Ada took a scrap of county stationery and drew a route in pencil. Go down Pleasant Street until you feel the grade turn. Keep toward Rogers. When you see the old paint store with the blue awning, take the lane behind it. Do not use the main fish market entrance. The front stairs are rotten through. There is a side stair from the alley, iron railing. 3 flights. Step on the outside of each tread, not the middle. The middle lies. She marked a square. This is the spur. Wharf, spur 3. The sign may still say Marden Fish, unless weather has finished the argument. Is there a key? Ada looked at her for a long moment, then opened a bottom drawer and removed a tag of dull tin from a hook. A single key hung from it, blackened, long-shanked, the teeth worn but present. On the tag, in faded ink, someone had written Loft in block letters. "I cannot promise it works. I understand." Ada held it out, then did not let go at once. "Miss Vane," she said, "if the upper landing shifts, turn back. Pride has drowned better people than poverty." "I will be careful. I believe you might." The key dropped into Isla's palm, colder than the room. Outside, the afternoon had lowered itself toward dusk. Gloucester's streets were not arranged for strangers in a hurry. They rose, narrowed, crooked, and opened suddenly onto views of working water, then closed again between clapboard buildings, brick storefronts, and houses that seemed to have leaned into weather so long that standing straight would have looked foolish. Isla passed a hardware store with frost-salted windows, a bakery whose sign had a painted rolling pin, a laundromat humming behind fogged glass, a marine supply shop displaying orange buoys and coils of line, and a diner with steamed windows where someone set down plates beneath yellow lamps. She stopped outside each one longer than she meant to, not to enter, to understand the order of things. The hardware store had shovels, lanterns, roofing nails, stove polish buckets, and a handwritten card reading credit by agreement only. The bakery smelled of yeast and cinnamon through a door that opened briefly for a man in a wool cap. The laundromat gave off a damp warmth that made her knees ache with wanting. The marine supply shop had brass cleats in the window polished to a hard shine. The diner had a pie case near the register, and a woman inside wiping a counter in slow circles. These businesses were not charming in the way visitors used the word. They served the waking needs of a town that still rose before daylight and went to bed with salt drying on its cuffs. At the corner of Rogers Street, the harbour widened into view. Boats sat at their berths with lines creaking faintly, masts ticking against the grey. A gull dropped hard onto a piling and settled its wings. Somewhere below, a man shouted one practical sentence and received another. The sky carried no colour except pewter and a dim bruise of winter cloud beyond the breakwater. Isla found the blue awning Ada had described. Behind it ran a lane hardly wider than a truck, its pavement broken and patched, edged by trash bins, stacked fish crates and doors with rusted hinges. A tabby cat crossed ahead of her carrying something soft in its mouth. Farther down, a black dog behind a chain-link fence stood, watched her without barking, then retreated under a plywood lean-to as if it had already decided her case. Walnut trees grew where no one had given them permission, 2 of them behind a sagging fence, their branches bare and black against the lowering sky. Their leaves gone bronze and nearly dissolved had gathered in wet heaps along the alley wall. Isla noticed them because Ada's pencil map had marked the trees with 2 quick loops, as if they mattered more than they should have. The building stood at the end of the lane, attached to nothing with confidence. The fish market below was 1 story of weathered clapboard over brick, about 22 feet wide and 38 feet deep, with a false front that had once been painted white and now held the grey-green exhaustion of salt air. Above it sat the loft, tucked beneath a mansard roof patched in 3 kinds of shingle, its narrow windows dark, its trim flaking in long curls. A square brick chimney rose from the rear slope, crooked but not fallen. A rusted iron sign hung on 2 chains above the boarded market door, Marden Fish and Provisions. One chain was shorter than the other, so the words tilted toward the alley, as if the building had grown tired of announcing itself. The side stair began behind a leaning stack of lobster traps. It climbed along the exterior wall in 3 flights, iron rails pocked with rust, wooden treads bolted into brackets that had stained the clapboard beneath them. The first tread complained under Isla's shoe. She shifted her weight to the outer edge as Ada had instructed. The second held, the third gave a little, then settled. She climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, one hand holding the portfolio close. Halfway up, the smell of the place changed. Below was fish rot, salt, stale ice, tar and abandoned commerce. Above was wet wood, bird droppings, cold dust, and something faintly sweet beneath decay, like cedar sealed in darkness. At the second landing she paused. The alley below had narrowed into shadow. A neighbour's window glowed across the lane, and inside it a person moved behind a curtain without looking out. The final flight rose to a door set under a slanted roof overhang. The door was pine, thick, hand-planned, painted once a deep green and then repainted brown long after anyone cared. The latch plate had been replaced, but the hinges looked original, hammered black iron with decorative points dulled by paint. Someone had scratched numbers into the frame with a nail, perhaps inventory, perhaps warning. Isla put the key in the lock. It did not turn. She withdrew it, wiped the teeth on the inside of her coat, tried again, lifting the door slightly by the handle as her father had once done with a swollen shed door. The key resisted, then moved a fraction. She stopped, breathed once, and turned with steady pressure. Inside the lock, something long unused gave way, not with a click but with a dry inward cough. The door opened 2 inches and stopped against debris. Cold air came out. Not fresh cold. Kept cold. The breath of a room shut through seasons. Isla set her shoulder to the door and pushed. Something scraped along the floorboards inside, then rolled away. The gap widened enough for her to enter sideways. She stepped over the threshold into a narrow front room where evening had already gathered. At first, the loft was shapes. A counter along one wall. Shelves. A pot-bellied stove near the chimney. A table under the front windows with one leg propped on a brick. Newspaper on the floor, swollen and buckled by damp. A ladder to a storage ledge. Bottles everywhere. Her eyes adjusted by degrees. The front room had 2 windows facing the harbour. Their panes filmed with salt and grime, one cracked from corner to corner in a white lightning line. Beneath them, dust had gathered in drifts fine as flour. The ceiling sloped low at the edges, high enough at the centre for a tall man to stand. Hooks hung from beams, some holding coils of thread hardened by time, some empty. On the wall to the left were outlines where tools had once hung, the wood paler beneath each absent shape. The smell was layered. Fish from below, though the market had been empty for years, mould in the corner near the stair door, mouse nests in paper, iron, old smoke, cold glass, and under all of it that sealed cedar note, patient and dry, as if a wooden box somewhere had kept its own counsel against damp and neglect. The floorboards gave different sounds beneath her. Near the door, a thin whine. By the stove, a solid knock. Under the front windows, a hollow complaint she avoided after the first step. Ada's warning had been plain. The building spoke if she listened. She did not light anything at once. There was no electricity to summon. She opened the portfolio, removed the little flashlight she had bought used in Worcester, and clicked it on. The beam was weak but serviceable. It crossed the shelves and caught on glass necks, cork stoppers, dust-furred twine, a chipped mug, a rusted tin of Brad's, a stack of yellowed envelopes tied shut, and dozens of unfinished miniature hulls resting belly up like sleeping fish. Isla moved the beam back. On the highest shelf, near the ceiling where shadows remained even under direct light, sat a bottle unlike the others. It was black glass, squat-bellied, thick-necked, and sealed with wax so dark it almost disappeared against the dust. Inside, barely visible, stood the shape of a galleon under full rig, its masts crowded, its tiny sails furled like folded wings. The glass swallowed detail. The object looked less displayed than hidden in plain sight. She stood looking at it longer than caution required. Then the flashlight flickered, and the room returned almost wholly to dusk. The back room was reached through a low doorway beside the chimney. Isla ducked beneath the lintel and entered a space narrower than the front, with a sloped ceiling and one rear window facing the walnut trees. Here the air was drier. Workbenches ran along 2 walls, their surfaces scarred by blades and dotted with old glue. A wooden stool lay overturned. A cracked porcelain basin sat beneath the window, though no pipe fed it now. Against the rear wall, a cabinet with warped doors held bundles of dowel, matchsticks sorted by size, cork discs, thread spools, tiny blocks, folded plans, and jars clouded with unknown contents. The workroom had been abandoned mid-breath. A strip of thread still ran from a clamp to a bottleneck. A pen had dried uncapped beside a ruler. On the bench lay a miniature mast no longer than Isla's little finger, tapered with such exactness that she could feel, even from a distance, the hand that had made it. She did not touch it. Not yet. The room seemed to require permission from itself. The rear window had no curtain. Through it she could see the 2 walnut trees and beyond them the dim backs of other buildings, their windows lighting one by one as evening thickened. Someone across the lane was cooking onions. The smell entered through a crack in the sash and made her stomach tighten with a slow, plain ache. She made an inventory of immediate danger because panic had no practical use. Roof leak over stairwell. Cracked front window. Questionable floor near harbour wall. Stove condition unknown. Chimney unknown. No bed. No water. Door lock uncertain. Rodent presence likely. Weather dropping. Then she made an inventory of immediate mercy. Door closed. Walls still stood. Rear room drier. Workbench broad enough to sleep beside. Newspaper for insulation if layered. Portfolio dry. Penknife safe. County paper legal. Wind outside. The first task was the door. She pushed away the debris that had blocked it, mostly fallen plaster, a broken crate, and one glass float wrapped in netting. The lock worked better from inside after she lifted the latch with both hands. There was a wooden bar in brackets across the door. Warped but solid. She set it into place and listened to the room change once it knew she meant to stay. She found a broom without most of its straw and used it to clear a space in the back room. Dust rose and made her cough into her sleeve. Mouse droppings peppered the floor near the cabinet, so she chose the bench side instead, laying down newspaper in overlapping sheets, then a strip of old canvas she found folded beneath the table. She kept her coat on, her shoes stayed on. The portfolio became her pillow, hard under the back of her neck. Before lying down, she returned to the front room and stood before the stove. It was a compact cast-iron thing with claw feet, its belly rusted but not split, its door decorated with a worn relief of waves. Beside it sat a tin bucket holding grey ash hardened by moisture. On the mantel shelf above the stovepipe, someone had placed 3 miniature ships in clear bottles, their rigging slack but intact. She lifted one carefully and watched the tiny sails tremble inside the glass. Her fingers remembered before her mind arranged the memory. Do not punish the material. Invite it. She set the bottle back. The temperature fell after dark, not quickly at first, but steadily, with the cruel patience of November near water. Cold gathered under the door and along the floorboards. It entered through cracked panes and the roof seam, then settled around her ankles like water in a boat. Isla wrapped the canvas over her coat and tucked newspaper under the edges, every sound sharpened, the creak of the sign outside, the tap of a loose shingle, a rat or squirrel moving inside a wall, the distant horn from the harbour, low and almost human in the fog. She did not sleep early. Her body had learned not to trust first shelter. She lay with her eyes open, watching the rear window pale and darken as clouds moved over the town's reflected light. Once, footsteps passed in the alley below, stopped beneath the stairs, then moved on. Once the black dog barked twice, not at her, but at whatever darkness had crossed its own boundary. Near midnight, rain began. It struck the roof in scattered touches, then found the seam above the stairwell and began to drop into a metal pan somewhere in the front room. The sound was exact. 1 drop, pause, another, then 2 close together. She counted them until the count became a kind of rope. Hunger remained, but it had quieted from demand into presence. Exhaustion came in layers. Her feet throbbed. Her shoulders ached from carrying the portfolio. Her hands smelled of county paper, old brass and dust. Beneath her cheek the leather gave off its familiar cracked scent, and inside it lay the ruler, the penknife, the remaining papers, the last narrow proofs of work stolen but not erased. In the hours before dawn, the loft settled around her. Not warmly, not safely, but with an aged, listening stillness that did not ask her to explain why she had come. The house had been waiting, and now she had begun to wait with it. At first light, Isla learned that water had a way of finding every neglected place in a building before a person did. The pan near the stairwell held less than an inch, but the dark stain above it spread wider than it had looked in the flashlight beam, feathering across the plaster like a map of a continent no one wanted to claim. She moved the pan under the most faithful drip, then found 2 chipped bowls, a coffee tin, and the bottom half of a broken crate that could hold water until the wood swelled and leaked at its seams. There was no sink that worked, no tap in the back room, and no kind pipe willing to surprise her. By mid-morning she had followed a narrow alley behind the market to a locked yard where weeds grew through fish scales gone silver with age. Beyond that, between a collapsed fence and a stack of blue barrels, stood an exterior spigot fixed to the brick wall of the neighbouring building. It had a handle shaped like a cross and a rust stain beneath it like an old wound. She turned it gently, expecting nothing. The pipe coughed, spat brown air, then gave a thin stream of water so cold it numbed her knuckles. She let it run until the colour cleared, filled the coffee tin, then the bowls, then an empty glass jug she found under the workbench after washing it with handfuls of gravel and more patience than soap. She drank standing in the alley with both hands around the jug. The water tasted of iron and distance. The outhouse was worse than she had hoped, better than she feared. Ada had not mentioned it, perhaps out of mercy. It stood behind the market in the wedge between the walnut trees and a sagging board fence, a salt-grey structure with a crescent cut into the door, and one hinge replaced by rope. Inside, leaves had blown through the gaps and settled over the seat. The roof did not leak much because almost no roof remained. Isla cleaned what she could, propped the door with a brick, and decided that dignity, like shelter, sometimes arrived in pieces too modest to be named. For 3 days, she lived by sounds. The front board near the harbour windows gave a hollow pop and then a long complaint, a void. The second board beside the stove knocked solid under the heel, trussed but lightly. The narrow plank at the doorway to the workroom squealed like a gull, harmless. The board beneath the highest shelf did not sound like the others. She noticed this on the second afternoon, but she had no strength then to consider it. Hunger made the body practical. Cold made it obedient. She cleaned in rings, beginning from the place where she slept. First, the newspapers sorted into dry and damp, then the mouse nests pushed into a bucket with a broken dustpan, then the glass wrapped in paper and carried downstairs. She tied a cloth across her nose when she swept droppings from the cabinet corners. The dust rose, settled on her eyelashes, and made her tears run without drama down both sides of her face. On the third morning, the wind turned northeast and drove a hard mist through the cracked pane. Isla walked to the hardware store she had seen on Rogers Street, carrying the county deed folded in her inner pocket, because some part of her still believed a warm counter might demand proof. The sign above the store read "A Kettle and Son Hardware," though no son appeared to be present. A brass bell announced her entry with a restrained little note. The room inside was longer than it looked from the street, and every wall held things that knew their purpose: handsaws, lantern mantles, sash cord, stove cement, roofing felt, hinges, nails in brown paper drawers, chisels kept under glass, mouse traps, buckets, work gloves, kerosene, twine, putty knives, and coils of rope arranged by thickness. The place smelled of sawdust, mineral spirits, oiled metal, seed potatoes, and coffee gone bitter on a hot plate. Behind the counter stood a man in his 70s with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyebrows that seemed to have escaped the discipline of the rest of him. He wore a green apron marked with pencil dust and had a jeweller's loop clipped to one pocket, though the hands he placed on the counter were large enough to close around a hammerhead. The name stitched above the apron pocket read Harold. He looked at Isla's shoes first, then her coat, then the cracked skin around her fingers. "Morning," he said. "Morning. You are the one who bought Marden's loft." She had not expected the town to move faster than paper. Yes. That stair will kill somebody who steps like a tourist. I have been using the outside of the treads. Good. Harold opened a ledger and turned one page. Ada called. Isla stood very still. She said if you came in looking for nails, I was to speak plainly and not fuss. He looked at her over the top of the ledger. I can do one of those. I do not have much money. No one taking that loft would. He removed a pencil from behind his ear. You need heat before pride. Chimney before fire. Water control before comfort. Roof before furniture. Floors after you know which ones mean to betray you. I know some tools, she said. Not houses. Houses are tools that got too large. Harold wrote something in the ledger. You know how to read? Yes. He turned, reached beneath the counter, and brought up a thick paperback with a cracked spine. The cover showed a cheerful couple in clean shirts holding a handsaw in front of a house no honest person had ever repaired. The title read Home Repair for the Practical Owner, 1974 Revised Edition. Do not believe the pictures, he said. The chapter on chimneys is decent. The roof section is overconfident. The glossary is useful if you ignore the jokes. I cannot pay for that. I did not ask you to. I cannot take charity. Harold tapped the ledger with his pencil. Once, then call it a manual on loan. How long? Until you know more than it does. She did not smile, but something in her face changed enough that he looked away to spare her the notice of it. I can open a credit account, he said. Limited. Written. You sign for every item. You pay when paid work finds you, or when you sell something lawful, or when spring comes and we can decide whether your conscience is heavier than your debt. I may not be able to. I know that. Then why? Because Ada said Vane. And because I remember Silas buying beeswax here in Squares and complaining mine had too much bloom. Harold's mouth shifted beneath his beard. Also because condemned buildings become everybody's problem when no one tries to save them. The account began with small things. Harold wrote each item carefully, and Isla repeated the prices as if learning a vocabulary. 1 pair canvas work gloves, 79 cents. 1 dust mask, 12 cents. 1 putty knife, 49 cents. 1 stiff wire chimney brush, $2.80 used. 6 feet of rope, manila, 36 cents. 1 pound 8 penny common nails, 58 cents. 1 pound 6 penny finish nails, 64 cents. 1 tin stove black, $1.10. 1 tube furnace cement, 93 cents. 1 box wooden matches, 11 cents. 1 bar yellow soap, 9 cents. 1 paper packet of mousetraps, 44 cents. 1 can kerosene, 27 cents. The sum looked impossible. It was small enough to shame a person and large enough to hold her in place. Harold tore the carbon sheet from the invoice and gave her the top copy. Do not light that stove until the flue is clean. I will not. I mean it. I understand. No, you do not. Creosote burns like it has been waiting for permission. He pointed toward the manual. Chapter 9. Read it twice. Then do the unpleasant part exactly. She carried the supplies back along Rogers Street under a sky, the colour of pewter rubbed thin. The hardware bag cut into her fingers, but the weight had order to it. For the first time in weeks, she was not merely carrying what remained, she was carrying what might begin. The chimney took most of the next day and a portion of the day after. Isla read the chapter 3 times, once by the front window, once beside the stove, once aloud in fragments, because instruction entered better through the mouth when fear made the mind slippery. She spread newspaper around the stove, removed the pipe collar with a screwdriver Harold had lent her after making her promise to return it, and set the hardened ash bucket under the flue opening. The creosote came down in black flakes, then in glossy scales, then in a powder so fine it seemed to darken the air itself. She tied the rope to the brush, climbed to the roof only as far as the rear slope allowed, and worked from the top first, lowering the brush with slow, careful strokes, raising it, lowering it again. The roof beneath her was slick with salt mist. She kept her knees wide and one hand on the brick. The chimney cap had rusted through in one corner, and a bird's nest long abandoned came free in a dry mat of twigs, feather and grey string. Inside she worked from below, feeding the brush upward until her arms shook. Soot settled in her hair and along the rim of her ears. Her gloves wore through at one thumb. She coughed so hard once that she had to sit on the floor with her back against the wall, eyes closed, while the loft breathed black dust around her. It took 7 hours the first day, 3 the second, and another hour to clean the pipe sections with rags twisted around a stick. She scraped the stove throat, she checked the damp. She sealed a hairline seam in the stovepipe with furnace cement, and waited because the label told her to wait, and impatience around fire was only another form of arrogance. When she finally set the first small fire, she used 3 curls of newspaper, 4 splinters from a broken crate, and 2 sticks no thicker than her wrist. She opened the damper, struck a match, and watched flame take paper, then wood, then air. Smoke hesitated, rolled once under the lid, and climbed. It went where it should, up. The stove ticked as it warmed. A dark smell rose from the iron, old dust and old ash and the bitter trace of heat returning to a thing not yet dead. Isla sat on the floor in front of it with her hands held out, palms aching as feeling came back into them. She did not laugh or cry. She only leaned close enough that warmth reached her face and made the soot on her cheeks tighten. Her first hot meal in the loft was not a meal anyone would remember for abundance. It was half a can of beans Harold had added to the bag without writing it down. Warmed in a dented tin cup she washed 3 times before trusting it. She ate with a spoon found in the back room, boiled first in water over the stove. The beans tasted of metal, salt, smoke and mercy. She ate slowly, scraping the cup clean, then held it in both hands until the last heat left. After that, she could look at the workroom without feeling like an intruder. She began with the cabinet nearest the rear window. On the top shelf were bundles of dowel rods tied with cotton string, each marked in pencil by diameter, 1/36 to 1/16, 3/36. Beneath them lay matchsticks sorted into shallow cigar boxes, some square-cut, some round, some already tapered. There were paper envelopes holding tiny brass eyelets, blocks, hooks, pins and beads, smaller than peppercorns. One jar held beeswax gone cloudy and cracked. Another held sand so fine it flowed like flour. A third held what looked like powdered pumice. In the second cabinet she found thread spools, linen and silk, black, tan, cream, rust red, all labelled with numbers whose system she did not yet understand. There were lengths of horsehair wrapped in tissue, small cork sheets, scraps of sailcloth cut from something older, and folded diagrams of rigging plans drawn with a steadiness that made her hands slow in respect. The handwriting was not Silas's. It was older, rounder, more formal, with certain letters made as if the writer had been taught by someone born before telephones became ordinary. The main workbench held tools in shallow drawers, tweezers with straight points, tweezers with bent points, pin visors, needle files, awls ground to different angles, a bone-handled knife with a blade narrow as a sliver of moon, 3 miniature clamps, a set of calipers in a velvet sleeve, a magnifier mounted on an articulated brass arm, a tiny plane no longer than her thumb, its iron wrapped separately in oiled paper. She did not use any of them. She laid them in rows on a clean section of canvas and made a list in the back of the manual, because naming a thing was the first form of safekeeping. On the wall above the bench were ghost shapes where larger tools had once hung, a saw, a mallet, a frame square, a hanging lamp. 4 nails held nothing at all near the ceiling. The highest shelf ran the length of the front room, crossing above the doorway into the workspace. It was built deeper than the others and set at an awkward height, reachable only by ladder. On it sat bottles, hull blanks, bundles of rolled paper, and the black glass galleon she had noticed on the first night. By then 3 days had passed, perhaps 4. Time inside a cold building arranged itself around tasks, not clocks. The fire gave modest heat when fed. The water came from the alley spigot. The outhouse door still argued with its rope hinge. Isla had begun to understand which floorboards could bear a bucket, which ones preferred a foot placed crosswise, which ones should be addressed only from the edges. It was while testing the upper shelf for dust and stability that she heard the wrong sound. She had pulled the ladder beneath it, tied the legs with rope to a beam hook so it would not slide, and climbed high enough to reach the first row of bottles. Most were clear and light when lifted, empty except for ships, dust, and time. A schooner in a square medicine bottle, a brig in green glass, a half-finished sloop whose mast lay folded along the deck, thread still trailing from the neck. When she lifted the black galleon, the shelf beneath it gave a different note. Not the shallow wood sound of pine against bracket. A deeper, close sound, a kept sound. She set the bottle down carefully, climbed one step lower, and tapped the underside of the shelf with her knuckle. Solid near the left bracket, solid near the wall, hollow behind the black bottle. She took the handle of the putty knife and tapped again. The hollow area was not large, perhaps 18 inches long, perhaps 6 deep, hidden behind a narrow strip of pine that had been stained to match the shelf face. No hinge showed, no pull, no crack wide enough for a fingernail. Weight told her more. The clear bottles around it lifted easily, their contents fragile but slight. The black galleon was heavier than glass and miniature wood could explain. It held its weight low, toward the belly. When she tipped it by a fraction, something inside did not move like a ship. She did not open anything that evening. She climbed down, put the bottle back where it had been, and made tea from hot water and the memory of tea because she had no leaves. Some discoveries deserve light. Some deserve steady hands. Hunger and darkness were poor witnesses. The next morning came pale and windless. Isla washed her hands twice in cold water, dried them on the cleanest cloth she owned, and brought the ladder back to the shelf. She set the black galleon on the workbench first. Then she examined the strip of pine with the magnifier from the bench. The seam was there, a line thin as a hair filled with dust and old varnish. At the right end, almost hidden beneath a smear of dark stain, was a circular plug of cedar no larger than a dime. It had no slot, no mark, only one tiny depression near the edge, as if a point had been pressed there long ago. She remembered Silas making hidden stands inside bottles, teeny counterweights disguised as deck cargo. He had used magnets once to lift an anchor through glass, lowing softly when Isla accused him of witchcraft. Invite it, he had said, and placed a sewing needle in her hand. She searched the tool drawers and found a magnet fixed to a length of wire, wrapped in paper hardened by age. The magnet had weakened but not died. She held it near the cedar disc. Nothing happened. She turned it over, tried the other pole, moved slowly around the circle. The disc clicked, not outward. Inward, the strip of pine loosened by the width of a breath. Isla set down the magnet, took the bent tweezers and eased the strip forward. It resisted because old varnish dislikes confession. She worked the putty knife along the seam, not prying hard, only persuading a flake broke free, then another. The strip came away in her hands, revealing a compartment lined in cedar, sealed so well that the scent rose fresh and sweet into the workroom, a summer breath released after years of dark. Inside were 3 packages wrapped in oilcloth, a tin box the size of a Bible, and a flat bundle tied in black ribbon. She did not remove them quickly. The first oilcloth package came out with both hands. It was long and narrow, bound by waxed twine. She laid it on the bench and untied the knots rather than cutting them, though the twine fought her. Inside lay heirloom tools, 2 pairs of jeweller's tweezers, a rosewood-handled awl, a miniature block plane, 3 rigging needles, a brass pin vise, and a knife with a folding handle of dark bone. Each tool had been cleaned, oiled, and wrapped separately in linen. None bore a maker's mark except for a tiny incised V on the awl handle, cut so fine it appeared only when turned toward the light. The second package held raw material, strips of pearwood and boxwood, thin as wafers, dowel no thicker than broom straw, a packet of handmade paper, cream-coloured and crisp at the edges, linen thread in skeins, 2 pieces of ivory-coloured sailcloth, likely cotton but woven finer than anything in the cabinet, a square of beeswax wrapped in parchment, still faintly honey-scented, a twist of gold wire finer than hair. The third package held plans, not house plans, not craft patterns only, technical drawings in 2 kinds of hand. Some were for bottle ships, hull sections, mast hinges, rigging sequences, bottle measurements, pulley diagrams for raising sails after insertion. Others made Isla sit down before she understood why her knees had weakened. They were marine design sketches, older than her father's, related to his, not the same, but kin to them in principle, stabilizing ideas, counterbalance assemblies, folded fin geometries, notes on drag reduction written in careful pencil along the margins. She saw the ancestry of her own work there, not copied, not stolen, but inherited through observation, harbour life, and minds that had watched vessels suffer and wanted them to suffer less. She placed those papers under a clean board so the corners would not curl. The tin box remained. Its lid was plain except for a stamped rim. Rust had touched one corner but not entered. Inside, beneath a folded cloth, lay coins in paper rolls and loose stacks, a silver pocket watch stopped at 2.17, a military medal on a faded ribbon, and an envelope addressed in brown ink, to the next careful hand. Isla did not open the envelope. She looked at it, then placed it beside the box with its face down. Words could wait until the room was ready. The money she counted because money had become weather. It determined whether a roof could be patched, whether a debt could be paid, whether beans came hot or not at all. She counted on the workbench using 3 piles and a notebook page. There were 43 silver dollars, most worn smooth at the cheek and eagle, dated between 1881 and 1921. There were 18 half-dollars, Barber and Walking Liberty both, the older ones dark at the edges. There were 26 quarters, 42 dimes, 19 nickels, and a paper roll of wheat cents that had split at one end, spilling copper across the cloth. There were also 7 gold coins, each wrapped in tissue so old it had browned where folded, $5 half eagles heavy and startling in the palm. In the bottom of the tin box, beneath the watch, lay 2 banknotes in brittle sleeves and a small ledger page listing values in a hand that had added twice, then checked once more. The total, written at the bottom in ink, was $612.43. Isla counted it again and reached $612.38. She found the missing 5 cents under the cloth, a Liberty head nickel lodged in the seam. Then the number matched, $612.43. It was not fortune. It was not rescue in the grand manner, but it was chimney cement, roof tar, food, lamp oil, nails, glass, and time. It was a margin between living and leaving. It was the sort of money someone had saved 1 coin at a time, then hidden not for greed, but for continuity. The medal lay beside the watch. She lifted it by its ribbon and saw the tarnished face of a Spanish campaign medal, the year 1898 stamped beneath a worn eagle. On the back, scratched lightly by hand rather than engraved by a professional, were initials, TV. The ribbon had faded almost to the colour of dust, but a thread of red still held in one fold. Isla set it down with more care than the coins. The flat bundle tied in black ribbon remained apart from the tin. She untied it last. Inside was a packet of parchment and vellum, protected between 2 cedar boards. The outer sheet was blank, except for 3 words in the same brown ink. For proof kept. Beneath it lay drawings so familiar in structure that Isla stopped breathing for several seconds. Not the ancestral sketches from the oilcloth package. These were her father's original marine patents, or the seed of them. clean stabilizer geometry, unaltered ballast channel diagrams, early notes in Isla Vane's hand, and amendments written in another hand she did not know. Some pages bore dates from before Isla was born. Some bore witness stamps. One had a filing number crossed out and rewritten. At the bottom of the cedar bundle was a thinner envelope, modern compared with the rest, though still aged at the corners. Inside it was a folded parchment strip, and on that strip, written in a careful block hand, were bank instructions, a Swiss account number, and a notation of deposited funds, $75,000 held for design restitution and lawful claim. There was also the name of a Boston attorney long dead, followed by a successor firm address that might or might not still exist. Isla stared at the number until it stopped being a number and became silence. The black glass galleon sat at the end of the bench, watching with its sealed dark belly. She had not yet opened it. She understood then that the bottle itself held another chamber, or had been made around one, and that the compartment in the shelf had guarded only the first door. The wax at the neck bore the same tiny V as the ship inside, crowded with masts and furled sails, hid its true cargo behind black glass. She did not break the wax. Not that day. There are revelations too large for cold fingers. There are rooms that must be swept before they are asked to receive the dead. By afternoon, the light had shifted towards silver. Isla placed the coins back in the tin box, except for 3 cents she left on the bench and then returned because even that felt premature. She rewrapped the tools not as tightly as before and set the plans beneath a board. The father's drawings she slid into her portfolio between 2 pieces of cardboard, hands careful, face still. The bank instructions she folded along their original creases and put beneath the envelope marked to the next careful hand. The letter remained unread. She made the stove fire small and steady, warmed water in the dented cup, and washed soot from her wrists. The room smelled now of cedar, iron, old cloth, smoke and rain not yet fallen. Outside, the harbour had entered that hour when working boats become silhouettes, and the water takes what light remains without reflecting it generously. Near dusk, Isla carried the sealed letter in one hand and walked down the exterior stairs. She did not go far. At the foot of the building she crossed the alley and stood near the fence by the walnut trees, where the ground sloped toward the dark water beyond the wharf. The black dog watched from under its lean-to, chin on paws, giving no opinion. The tide was moving out. She could hear it below the pilings. A sucking, patient sound, water drawing away from wood, then returning in small corrections. A gull cried once and was answered by nothing. Across the harbour, lights came on in houses climbed along the shore, each one modest against the size of the evening. Isla held the envelope but did not open it. Paper could carry the living into the room too quickly. She needed one night to remain ignorant by choice, one night in which the dead had knocked but not yet entered. She stood until cold found the seams of her coat, and the first stars appeared over Gloucester, faint as pinholes in worn cloth. Then she went back upstairs, barred the door, placed the sealed letter beside her on the floor, and lay down with her hand resting over it. The house had been waiting, and now she had begun to wait with it. Morning came without sunrise, only a gradual thinning of darkness behind the rear window and the sound of gulls arguing somewhere above the fish market roof. Isla woke before the stove had fully died, the room still holding a low seam of warmth near the floorboards and a colder layer above her face. Her hand had not left the sealed envelope during sleep. The paper was under her palm, dry and firm, as though it had spent the night keeping watch over her rather than the other way around. She sat up slowly. Dust moved in the first grey light. The tin box remained on the workbench, closed. The oilcloth packages lay in their careful rows. The black glass galleon stood apart, its dark belly gathering the room into itself. Nothing had vanished. Nothing had solved itself. She washed at the porcelain basin with water from the jug, though the water was cold enough to sting. She cleaned her fingernails with the dull back of Silas's penknife. She folded the canvas she had slept under. Then she placed the envelope on the workbench beneath the rear window, where the light was weak but honest. The handwriting on the front was not Silas's. She had known that from the night before. Silas wrote in a slanted spare hand, letters leaning forward as if walking into wind. This hand was older, rounder, held upright with schooling and restraint, but there was something in the spacing, in the way the words were given room to breathe, that made Isla's throat close. She had seen a version of that care in her father's margins. She had seen it in Silas's labels on thread packets. She had seen it, perhaps, in every careful hand that had touched the tools now lying on the bench. The seal had been made with plain wax, pressed not by a ring but by the end of a small brass tube. It bore the same mark cut into the awl, the same tiny V hidden on the bottle. Isla warmed the wax between her fingers until it loosened enough to lift without breaking. She opened the flap. Inside were 4 pages, folded twice. The paper was thick, cream-coloured, and faintly rippled at the edges. It smelled of cedar, metal, and the dry sweetness of time kept out of damp. At the top of the first page, the ink had browned but not faded. Isla drew the stove-warmed stool beneath her, sat with both feet flat on the floor, and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, if these pages have reached your hands, then either the shop has failed in the eyes of the town, or it has succeeded in the deeper way by outlasting all of us who were known by name. I write not for a customer, nor for a judge, nor for any official keeper of records. I write for the next careful hand that finds this room and knows, before being told, that small work is not lesser work. My name is Abigail Vane Marden. I was born in Gloucester in 1874, daughter of Thomas Vane, who came to this harbour from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, with a sail needle in his coat and no promise except the one he made to his own hands. My mother was Eliza Pruitt of Rockport, whose father cupped blocks for schooners and whose mother kept a boarding table for men who smelled of cod and rope tar. Thomas was the son of Nathaniel Vane, born 1838 in Yarmouth, Maine, and Nathaniel was the son of Mercy Bell Vane, who crossed down from New Brunswick after the hard winter of 1816 with 2 children, a Bible and a whalebone fid wrapped in linen. I married Samuel Marden in 1896, and because his family sold fish from the lower floor, our names were joined on the sign, though the upper room remained Vane work in everything but paint. Here my father made half models for builders, rigging miniatures for widows, teaching models for boys sent out too young, and bottle ships for men who wanted proof that patience could survive a narrow opening. I write because Dr. Henry Whitcomb of Boston, whom I saw at Massachusetts General in March of 1931, has told me the shadow in my breast has gone into the glands and will not be argued with for long. He was kind in the manner of educated men who have practised sorrow. I believe him. I do not fear the dying so much as I fear the careless dispersal of what was kept. This trade began to close for our family on October 14th, 1918, when the telegram came from my brother Thomas from France. He had gone with the 26th Division, and though he was not the first Gloucester son lost to that war, he was the one whose absence removed the last young hand from this bench. My husband Samuel died in the influenza week that followed. My son, little Daniel, had already been buried in the September ground behind the old cemetery wall. After that, the upper room made no sound for 32 years except my knife, my thread, and the winter stove. The town believed I made souvenirs. Let them. A bottle ship sold to a summer man paid for flour, as well as any noble work. Yet inside these bottles and in these drawers are measurements, ideas and methods passed from working vessels to miniature vessels and back again. Remember that a model is not a toy if it teaches the hand what the sea will punish. For the ship in black glass, do not break the bottle, warm the wax just enough to free the collar. There is a sleeve inside the neck, turned from cedar and held by 2 pins set opposite. Use the bent tweezers and the magnet rod. Draw the pins together before lifting. If you force it, you will destroy what was entrusted. For hulls, Pearwood takes the knife kindly when the room is above 60 degrees and the blade has been stropped on leather. Boxwood holds a sharper aris, but will split if the grain is insulted. Thin hide glue, 1 part glue to 2 parts water. Let it bloom overnight. Then warm it in a cup set inside hot water, never over direct flame. If it smells burnt, begin again. For sails, starch linen lightly and dry it under weight for 12 hours. Beeswax rigging thread only after twisting, not before, or it will take dust into every fibre. Raise masts inside the bottle in order of aftermost first, then main, then fore, pausing between each pull so the joints remember their direction. For plaster in this room, if it fails, use lime with sharp sand at 3:1, and hair enough that the hawk holds together when tilted. For the stove, small fires cure better than proud fires. For the roof, water must be persuaded downhill, not merely forbidden to enter. I have hidden money, tools and papers, because inheritance is not always blood and not always law. It is sometimes a bridge laid in darkness by someone who will never see who crosses it. Spend little, repair first. Eat enough to keep your hands from shaking. If there is more than you need, keep it for the next one. For there is always a next one, though pride tells every generation it is the last. Behind the walnut tree nearest the alley fence, there is a horseshoe grown nearly into the bark. My father nailed it there, the summer I turned 25, saying luck should be fastened where roots could argue with it. If the tree still stands, greet it for me. You may be a vane, or you may be only a person with patient fingers and nowhere else to go. That distinction matters less than people claim. Keep the bench clean, keep the tools oiled, do not sell the black bottle unless hunger is at the door and winter has taken all other choices. Even then, forgive yourself before you do what must be done. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Abigail Vane Marden, November 3, 1931. Isla read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, letting each name find its place in the room. The stove gave a faint inward click as the last coal surrendered. A gull landed on the roof with a scrape of claws and then lifted off again. Somewhere below, wind passed through the boarded market and made a sound like a door almost speaking. She placed the pages on the bench in order and rested both hands beside them, not touching the ink. The letter had not called her rescued. It had not praised endurance or promised ease. It had offered instructions that steadied her more than comfort could have done. The dead woman had not written as a saint. She had written as a craftswoman who knew roofs leaked, glue scorched, hunger shook the hand, and paper could carry justice only if someone kept it dry. Isla folded the pages along their original creases. Not new creases. Not her own. She slid them back into the envelope, leaving the flap open, then set the envelope beneath the brass magnifier where no stray draught could lift it. The walnut tree waited behind the building as if it had heard its own name read aloud. She took the stairs carefully. Morning had sharpened the alley. The fish crates were rimmed with frost. The black dog watched from the chain-link fence, standing now ears forward but body settled. A delivery truck groaned somewhere on Rogers Street. The harbour beyond the wharf was the colour of pewter and torn paper, the tide turning under the pilings with a slow correction. The two walnut trees stood side by side near the leaning fence. One was younger, thinner, its bark smoother, and its branches reaching toward the alley. The other had a broader trunk, ridged and dark, with one low limb that turned outward like an arm making room. Isla walked around it once, boots sinking into wet leaves. She found scars where branches had been cut, a hollow where squirrels had gnawed, a patch of lichen shaped like an island. Then, on the side facing the water, half swallowed by bark, she saw iron. The horseshoe had nearly disappeared into the tree. Only the outer curve remained visible, black with age, its nail heads buried deep. The bark had folded over the ends in slow lips, holding it not as an ornament, but as a wound healed around a promise. Isla brushed away damp moss with her thumb. Cold iron met skin. She stood there for a long time. There was no vision, no sudden breeze bearing a voice, only a condemned loft behind her, a harbour before her, and an iron shoe fastened by a man dead before her father was born. Yet the proof of the letter was there under her hand, not an idea, not a symbol made convenient for sorrow. A physical thing, grown into a living trunk across years of weather, indifference, taxes, fish stink, rot and forgetting. She pressed her palm flat against the bark above it. When she returned upstairs, the room looked altered because she now knew it had been addressed to her, though not by name. The bench was no longer debris, the stove no longer merely iron, the bottles no longer curiosities. Even the broken plaster carried instruction inside its failure. She moved with a slower care than before, not reverent exactly, but exact. On the rear workbench, behind a row of jars, she had found the day before a small candle wrapped in tissue. It was thick, ivory-coloured, and bent slightly at the middle, perhaps from decades of summer heat. A label tied around it with thread-red Bayberry. Christmas 1962, save for first full work night. The script was not Abigail's. It might have been Silas's, or another hand between them. The candle had survived drawer damp, heat, dust, and every casual clearing that had emptied other rooms of their past. Isla set it in a brass holder shaped like a scallop shell and trimmed the wick with the penknife. She waited until late afternoon, when the light began leaving the harbour windows and the room asked for flame. Then she struck one match. The wick caught slowly. The flame was modest, blue at the base, gold above, steady after a first tremble. Bayberry scent entered the room, green and resinous, so clean against fish rot and soot that the air seemed to open a hidden drawer. Isla placed the candle on the workbench near the letter, far from paper, far from cloth, and sat before it with the manual, the tools, and the unopened black bottle arranged in a half circle. The candle did not make the room bright. It made a small island of attention. She took the rosewood awl from its linen wrap and oiled the handle with a drop from the tin Harold had sold her. The wood drank it dark. She wiped each tweezer clean, tested the meeting of the tips, and laid them parallel. She examined the black galleon's wax collar under the magnifier, but did not attempt to open it. The letter had said to warm the wax just enough. She did not yet know what enough felt like in this room. So she practiced on waste. From the cabinet she selected a broken bottle neck and an old cork sleeve that had already failed. She warmed a little wax near the candle, watched it shine, watched it slump, watched the point at which it lost firmness but not shape. She practiced drawing 2 tiny pins inward with bent tweezers. She failed the first time, then the second, then the 5th. The 6th time, the sleeve lifted without cracking. Care did not erase fear. It gave fear a task. As evening settled, the room gathered its own witnesses, the father's drawings in the portfolio, the ancestral plans beneath their board, the tin box closed, the coin rolls returned, the military medal wrapped in cloth, the candle flame leaning whenever wind found a seam. Isla was not alone in the sentimental way people sometimes mean. She was alone with evidence that was different. Evidence could not embrace, but it could hold. She began naming the small kindnesses that had carried her here. Not aloud at first, but by arranging them in order as a craftsperson arranges tools before work. Mrs. Keenan Lowell, pressing wool socks into her hands without making a ceremony of it. The diner owner in Peabody setting down chowder and walking away before pride could refuse. The Gloucester librarian drawing the map and not asking whether Isla had a place to sleep. Ada Merrow, counting the 4 worn bills as if they were any other lawful payment. Harold Kettle, pretending credit was merely ledger work and not a bridge. None of them had saved her. That would be too large a claim and unfair to the difficulty that remained. But each had placed one plank across one gap. People survive more often by planks than by grand rescue. A sock, a bowl, a pencil map, a plain warning, a manual with bad pictures and decent chimney advice. And you listening now may know the weight of such a plank. Maybe someone once let you sit through rain over a single cup of coffee. Maybe a neighbour shoveled your walk without saying anything about it. Maybe a teacher kept your name on a list after everyone else had crossed it off. Maybe a stranger gave directions with respect when you had grown used to being moved along. If you remember a small kindness that arrived when you had no way to repay it, tell us about it in the comments. Not because the internet needs another story, but because someone reading may be in the narrow place between giving up and taking one more careful step. The candle burned lower, Wax gathered along one side where the holder tilted, and Isla turned it by a quarter-inch so the melt would even. That was Silas's habit, one she had forgotten until her fingers did it without instruction. The memory came not as ache but as movement. His kettle, his tweezers, his voice telling her not to punish the material, his thumb braced against a matchstick mast. She opened the envelope once more before sleep and touched only the blank margin below Abigail's name. Then she placed the letter in the tin box, not hidden again in the shelf, but set within reach on the workbench. The dead had waited long enough in darkness. They could keep company with the room now. She wrapped the military medal in a clean cloth and laid it beside the penknife. The awl, tweezers, plane, and magnet rod. She returned to their linen, then placed them in a shallow drawer she had swept and lined with paper from the least damaged newspaper. The black glass galleon remained on the bench, still sealed, its contents waiting behind dark glass and old wax for a day when her hands had learned the necessary restraint. Before lying down, she carried the bayberry candle to the stove side and pinched it out with damp fingers rather than blowing ash across the room. Smoke rose in a thin line and vanished into the cold. That night, Isla did not sleep on the floor as a trespasser. She slept beside the heirlooms with her coat still buttoned, the canvas drawn to her chin, the leather portfolio under her head, and the tin box close enough that one hand could rest against it in the dark. The first snow came on December 3rd, a hard 4 inches that began before dawn and covered the alley crates, the walnut roots, the broken pavement, and the tilted sign below in one plain cloth of white. By 7 in the morning, the roof seam above the stairwell had turned from a drip to a steady ticking, and the pan beneath it filled so quickly that Isla had to empty it down the exterior steps every hour. Snow does not forgive holes because a person is poor, it only finds them more slowly than rain. She read the roofing chapter 3 times, sitting beside the stove with Harold's manual open across her knees. The pictures showed a smiling man in a clean shirt laying shingles under June sunlight. Isla ignored his expression and studied the diagrams: drip edge, starter course, felt underlayment, exposure line, ridge cap, valley flashing. She repeated the words until they became less like a foreign language and more like instructions spoken through bad translation. The roof itself was worse than it had looked from the alley. The mansard face toward the harbour had lost patches of asphalt shingle where wind had lifted the tabs and salt had done the rest. The upper seam near the chimney had failed under a crude tar patch laid years before by someone more hopeful than skilled. At the rear, 2 sheathing boards had softened near the eave, and one rafter tail had begun to sag as if tired of pretending. She measured with twine first, then with a borrowed tape after Harold told her twine stretched when cold and wet. The damaged plane was 12 feet 6 inches along the eave and 14 feet to the ridge line, not counting waist overlaps and the awkward hip return where the old roof changed angle. She wrote the numbers on the back of an invoice. Asphalt shingles, 4 bundles would cover it if she did not make mistakes. 5 if honesty was included. £15 roofing felt, 1 roll. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, £2. Drip edge, 12 feet front and 12 feet rear, though Harold said she would curse the extra joint and sold her a longer length at cost. Roof cement, 1 can. Step flashing near chimney, 8 pieces, reused if salvageable, replaced where torn. When she showed him the list, Harold took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You need more nails. I calculated by square. You calculated like a book." She looked at the paper again. "Books do not drop nails into gutters," he said. He went into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet darkened by age, its head worn bright along the blade, the hammer face mushroomed slightly at the edges. A leather thong had been tied through the handle hole. He set it on the counter with no drama. "This was my brother's," he said. He roofed half the harbour after the hurricane of '54. He would not admire that loft, but he would admire a straight chalk line. "I cannot buy it. I am not selling it. I can borrow it. You can return it when the roof no longer leaks on your stairs." The hatchet was heavier than it looked, balanced toward the head. An honest tool from a time before handles were shaped for display. Isla carried it back under her coat so snow would not wet the steel. The skilled elder arrived the next morning without appointment. Isla heard someone on the stairs and opened the door with the stove poker in her hand. On the landing stood a compact man near 80, wearing a navy watch cap, a canvas coat whitened at the seams with old dust, and boots laced with orange cord. His face was narrow, weathered, and closely shaved except for 2 grey sideburns cut square. He carried a tool belt rolled under one arm. "Name's Emmett Pike," he said. Isla lowered the poker. "Harold says you mean to go on that roof." "I do." "Not alone." "I cannot pay." "Did not ask." The conversation ended there because Emmett had already turned to examine the stair rail, testing each joint with one gloved hand. He was a former roofer, Harold told her later, retired after a fall from a church steeple left one knee unwilling to bend in certain weather. Emmett would not take money. He would not take tea until work paused by his own decision. He would not take thanks except with a grunt that ended the matter. For 11 days they worked when wind allowed and retreated when it did not. Emmett's teaching was terse and exact. He showed her how to lay a chalk line and snap it without smearing blue dust across wet felt. He showed her how to cut shingles from the back with the hook of the hatchet blade. He taught her to hold a nail between 2 fingers, set it square, and drive it in 3 strokes: seat, sink, finish. Not proud, not buried, flush. "That nail's proud." Isla bent close. "Pull it." She pulled it. Again. She set another. Too deep. She pulled that one too. They sistered the weakened rafter by cutting a new length of 2x6 to span beyond the rot, fastening it alongside the old with 16-penny nails and carriage bolts Harold found in a coffee can. Emmett made her pre-drill near the split end. "Wood remembers insult," he said, and Isla looked at him once, sharply, because the words nearly belonged to Silas. Emmett did not notice. He was watching the drill angle. They replaced 2 sheathing boards near the eave, prying the old ones loose in pieces, soft as stale bread. Underneath, the cavity smelled of damp wool and mice. Isla cleaned it, packed no insulation because Emmett told her wet insulation would become a sin, and nailed the new boards across the rafters, leaving the slight expansion gap he tapped with the flat of his knife. The roof taught her several kinds of fear: the fear of height, the fear of wrong footing, the fear of weather moving faster than hands, the fear of striking a thumb already split by cold. But after the 3rd day, fear became one tool among others. She carried it up the ladder, used it to keep her knees bent and her weight low, and brought it down again when the light failed. On December 14th, the last ridge cap went down under a sky bright enough to hurt. Emmett checked every seam, every nail, every edge where water might try to argue. Then he climbed down, rolled his tool belt, and stood in the alley looking up. "It'll shed," he said. From him. It was almost a blessing. That night. Snowmelt ran down the new shingles and fell where it ought to fall, past the wall, into the alley, away from the stairwell. Isla stood inside beside the empty pan and listened to nothing drip. January entered through the chimney before she repaired it. The stove could be coaxed into warmth, but the bricks above the roofline had begun to spall, shedding faces in thin red flakes that landed on the shingles like broken crockery. Inside, powdered mortar sifted down around the stovepipe collar whenever wind struck from the northeast. The joints between the lower fire bricks had recessed to finger depth, and one brick near the throat shifted when touched with the poker. Harold came to look on the 2nd week of the year, climbing the stairs with the resigned expression of a man meeting an old enemy in a new coat. He crouched by the stove, scraped the mortar with a screwdriver, and held the powder to the light. "Too sandy," he said. Somebody patched with whatever swept off a floor. "I can repoint it. You can learn to repoint it." He wrote out the mix on a brown paper bag. 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fire clay for the firebox joints, water by feel, not flood, For the exterior joints above the roof, no Portland cement, he warned, unless she wanted the old brick faces to break faster next winter. Lime moved, hard cement bullied. The chimney was old enough to deserve a mortar that could yield. She bought a narrow pointing trowel on credit, a jointer, a cold chisel, and a wire brush. Emmett lent her a mason's hawk that had once belonged to a cousin. The handle was loose, and he told her not to fix it unless she understood why it had been left loose. She did not, so she left it. The work took 3 weeks, because cold slows everything except discomfort. Most mornings the temperature remained in the 20s, the alley spigot filmed with ice at the handle, the stair rail so cold it burned through gloves. Isla worked in intervals, 15 minutes raking out failed mortar, 5 minutes warming her hands over the stove, 15 minutes brushing dust from joints, 5 minutes flexing fingers until pain came back in clean lines. When her bare hands went numb, she stopped, because Harold had said numb hands made ugly work and dangerous choices. She raked each joint to sound material, deeper than looked polite, until the old mortar gave way to firmness. Dust fell down her sleeves. Brick powder reddened the cracks in her knuckles. The smell of the chimney was different from ordinary dirt. It held soot, mineral damp, cold ash, and the faint, bitter trace of fires long extinguished before she was born. Mixing mortar became its own lesson. Too dry, and it would not pack. Too wet, and it slumped from the joint with a contempt that felt personal. She learned to mound the sand and lime together first, fold them with the trowel, then add water by spoonfuls from a tin cup, waiting between additions because the mixture changed after resting. Fireclay made the firebox mortar silkier, almost greasy under the tool. Lime mortar for the exterior felt grainier, more forgiving, as if willing to be persuaded into place. She worked from the bottom up inside, pressing mortar deep with the pointing trowel, then striking the joints with the rounded jointer Harold had chosen to match the old profile. Each joint had to shed dust before it could accept repair. Each crack had to be cleared of what had failed. There was no shortcut that did not leave weakness hidden under a smooth face. On the roof, Emmett sat tied to the chimney by a rope belayed around a beam hook inside the loft, while Isla worked the upper courses. He did not climb higher than he should, though she could see it irritated him. He handed up bricks, flashing, and his opinion in short pieces. Pack the back. She packed it. Angle down. She corrected the tool. Brush now. She brushed. At night the chimney joints darkened and cured slowly in the cold. Isla kept only small stove fires, never hot enough to rush the lime. The room remained chilly, but the smoke drew better after the second week. The stove no longer coughed at lighting. The smell of powdered mortar faded from the mantel shelf. The test fire came late in January, on a morning so clear the harbour looked made of hammered tin. Harold stood inside by the stove. Emmett stood near the rear window with his cap in both hands, which was the closest he came to ceremony. Isla laid kindling in a crisscross no higher than her wrist, opened the damper and lit paper beneath it. The flame rose. Smoke gathered, narrowed, and went upward in one clean pull. No rollback. No cough. No soot falling like black snow. Outside, Harold climbed halfway down the stair, leaned into the alley, and looked toward the roofline. Clean, he called. Isla held her hands near the stove door and watched the fire take. For the first time, heat seemed to belong in the loft rather than trespass. The floors had waited under everything, under fish stink rising from below, under dust, under winter boots, under dropped plaster and coal grit, and the quiet traffic of mice. Once the roof held and the chimney drew, Isla began uncovering them with the caution of someone meeting a face beneath bandages. The boards were white pine, wide and uneven, some nearly 13 inches across, their edges worn into slight valleys where a century of feet had travelled the same paths. Many were fastened with cut nails, black-headed and stubborn, but in the rear workroom she found hand-cut rose-head nails still holding several planks near the bench. Their heads were irregular, each one catching light differently, and Harold told her not to replace them unless a board lifted. "You remove those for prettiness," he said, "and the house will know you are vain." She set every nail head by hand before sanding, using a nail set and a light hammer, tapping until each sat below the surface without bruising the surrounding wood. The hollow boards near the harbour windows were not trusted yet, so she marked them with pencil and left them for later repair. The solid centreboards she cleaned first with soap, warm water and a brush, working in the direction of the grain. Black water ran into the bucket. She changed it 6 times. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day from Harold's back shelf looked too modern for the room. A squat humming machine with a frayed cord and a dust bag that had been patched twice. He made her sign the rental card and showed her how to keep it moving. "Do not dig," he said. "I know. You know knives. This is louder." He gave her 3 grits, 80, 120, 20, 20. The first pass took off grime, raised splinters and the dead grey surface of neglect. The machine vibrated until her elbows ached. Dust filled the air despite the bag, pine dust, dry and golden, smelling suddenly of the forest the boards had once been. She wore the mask and still tasted wood on her tongue. The 80 grit pass revealed scars, burn marks near the stove, a long gouge where something heavy had been dragged, dark circles from old bottles, 3 square patches where benches had once been bolted down. She did not try to erase them. She only softened what would catch a bare foot and left the rest as record. The 120 grit pass quieted the boards. The grain began to show itself in lines of cream, amber and pale rose. The 220 grit pass was almost intimate work, slow and light, less correction than listening. In the corners, she sanded by hand with a block wrapped in paper, moving until the skin between her thumb and forefinger split. After vacuuming with Harold's borrowed shop vac, she wiped the boards with a damp cloth and waited for them to dry. Then came oil. She used a mixture Harold approved only after arguing with himself. 2 coats of tung oil thinned for penetration, 1 final coat of boiled linseed oil in the workroom where warmth and touch mattered more than shine. Thin coats, no puddles. Wipe after 20 minutes. 48 hours cure between coats if the weather stayed damp, longer if the boards felt tacky. The first coat darkened the pine from pale straw to dark honey. The second deepened it toward amber. By the final coat, the boards near the workbench had taken on a mahogany glow in the low winter light, not because pine had become something else, but because age and oil together had remembered warmth. There was one bad morning in the middle of it. She woke with her hands stiff, her back locked, and the kind of exhaustion that made every tool look accusing. The stove had gone out, the water jug was empty. A letter from a drafting office in Boston had arrived through general delivery, brief and polite, declining to consider her application after review of available professional history. The phrase sat on the table beside the oil rags like a small, well-dressed lie. She put on her coat and walked to the marsh north of the harbour without telling herself it was a decision. Snow lay in dirty ridges along the road. The wind had dropped. At the marsh edge, brown reeds stood in the ice, and a great blue heron moved through the shallows with such deliberate care that time seemed to narrow around its legs. It lifted 1 foot, paused, set it down, then waited long enough for waiting to become action. Isla sat on a cold stone and watched it. She did not work that day. No sanding. No oil. No sweeping to prove worthiness to a room that had already outweighted everyone. She stayed until the heron lifted itself into flight, wings slow and prehistoric against the white sky, and only then walked back. The next morning, she wiped the boards and began again. February made the windows impossible to ignore. Cold entered through them in visible ways, stirring candle flame, lifting ash and laying a frost lace along the inside of the cracked panes. There were 8 windows in all, 2 in the front room, overlooking the harbour, 1 narrow sash above the stair door, 1 by the stove, 2 in the rear workroom facing the walnut trees, 1 in the low storage alcove, 1 tiny square window in the back wall, hidden behind a warped cabinet until she dragged the cabinet aside. 3 had no glass at all, only cardboard rags or old newspaper stuffed between muntins. 4 were cracked, one badly enough that a triangular shard shifted whenever wind struck. The last was different. The rear workroom's left window still held wavy original glass, thick at the bottom, greenish along the edge, with tiny bubbles trapped inside like breath. A date had been scratched into the sash with a point, 1788. Perhaps the sash had been reused from an earlier building. Perhaps the number meant something else. But Harold looked at it and said, "Do not replace that one." I was not going to. Good. I wanted to hear you say it. Window work required a different patience than roofing, smaller and more exact, the kind that made Isla's old training rise in her fingers. She removed each sash slowly, labeling the top, bottom, left, right, because a century of settling had made every frame particular. A sash that belonged to one opening would not necessarily forgive another. She laid them across the workbench and scraped old putty with a dull chisel warmed near the stove until it softened enough to release. The DAP 33 glazing putty came in a pint tub from Harold's shelf, beige, oily and stiff in the cold. He showed her how to knead a portion in her palm until it softened, roll it into a rope and press it into the rabbet before setting the pane. "Points first," he said. "Bed the glass. Press without bullying, glazing points every 8 inches, more on loose muntins. Then the outer bevel, one clean pull of the putty knife, angled so water would run away and not stand against the glass." Her first bevel was ugly. The second worse because she tried too hard. The third began to understand the knife. Sash cord was its own lesson. The old cords had rotted inside the channels, leaving counterweights dropped in their pockets like stones in a well. She removed the access panels, reached into black dust, and brought each iron weight into the light. They were cold, narrow, and marked by numbers cast into the side. The replacement cord was 1/4 inch cotton, braided, strong, but willing. Harold had insisted on cotton over nylon because old pulleys, he said, deserved a cord that did not saw them to death. She threaded the cord over the pulley, tied the counterweight with a figure-8 knot, and tested the drop by hand. The first time, the knot slipped before tightening and struck the pocket bottom with a dull thud. Isla closed her eyes, retrieved it, and tied it again. The second held. She learned to leave enough tail, learned to trim only after testing, learned to feel balance return as the sash rose and stayed where her hand released it. For missing panes, Harold found salvaged glass in his basement, each piece wrapped in newspaper from years when prices had looked impossible in a different way. She cut 2 pieces herself with his glass cutter, scoring once, steady pressure, then snapping along the edge of the bench. The sound made her breath stop each time, that clean, crystalline answer between breakage and precision. The front room changed first, with glass set and cardboard removed. The harbour entered differently, not warmer, not yet, but clearer. Boats moved in the distance, and gulls became birds instead of shadows. The stair window came next, then the stove-side sash, then the storage alcove where cold had been pouring through a gap large enough for snow to gather on the sill. She left the original 1788 window for last. That morning, the air softened by a few degrees, enough that the putty worked under her hands without argument. She cleaned the wavy glass with vinegar water and newspaper, rubbing gently until light passed through in uneven bands. The old pane distorted the walnut branches outside, bending them as if seen through water. Its cracks were only in the glazing, not the glass. She removed the failed putty, replaced 2 rusted points, and bedded the edges anew with the careful restraint of someone tending skin. As she drew the final bevel, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside, so close its black cap and bright eye seemed painted onto the grey day. It tilted once toward her, gripping the twig with impossible feet. Isla stopped with the putty knife suspended above the sash. The bird remained. Then it flicked its wings, crossed to the horseshoe tree, and disappeared into the branches. Isla finished the bevel in one slow pull. The line held clean from corner to corner. She set the knife down, lifted the sash, and felt the counterweights take it evenly, neither dropping nor straining, but pausing where she left it, as a repaired thing should. The house had been waiting, and now she had begun to wait with it. By late February, the loft had grown warmer in the way repaired buildings do, not through luxury, but through the slow removal of insults. The windows no longer breathed at every seam, the chimney pulled clean, the roof had stopped sending weather down the wall. Yet near the stove, where old heat and new damp had argued for years, the plaster had failed in 3 patches large enough to show the bones beneath. The walls were not modern board, they were horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath, each strip nailed with old iron and spaced just wide enough for the first coat to push through and form keys behind it. In the broken places those keys had snapped. Chunks had loosened near the chimney breast, falling away in curved pieces that showed hair in the lime like pale threads in bread dough. Isla held one fragment in her palm and turned it toward the light. The surface had been smoothed by a hand long gone, but the back was rough, practical, made to grip what it could not see. Harold approved the repair only after kneeling before the wall and pressing the surrounding plaster with his thumb. "Do not patch only what fell," he said. "I have to cut back to sound edges." He looked at her, almost pleased. "The book taught you something. The house taught me more." He made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been his knee protesting as he stood. The horsehair came from a paper sack on the upper shelf of Harold's storeroom, labelled in blue pencil sometime in the 1950s. It smelled faintly of dust, tack rooms, and dry summer fields. He gave her a double handful in a folded newspaper and refused to write it in the ledger. "Too old to sell," he said. "Still useful. Most things are, if somebody knows where to put them." She mixed lime mortar on a scrap of plywood laid across the workbench, lime putty, sharp sand, hair teased apart by hand until it did not clump, and water added slowly. The scratch coat was pressed hard through the lath, not merely spread over the opening. She used the trowel edge to score it in shallow diagonal lines before it firmed, making a tooth for the next layer. For 3 days it cured in the slow, chilly room, protected from the stove's direct heat by a sheet of tin leaned against 2 bricks. The brown coat came next, 3/8 of an inch thick, built out to match the old plane of the wall. She floated it level with a straight edge Harold had lent her, then left it 72 hours because the manual Harold and the wall itself seemed in agreement that haste would ruin the work invisibly. During those days she did not touch the patches except to mist them lightly and look for cracks. The finish coat was thinner, 1/8 of an inch, pale and smooth beneath the trowel when mixed correctly. It took her 3 attempts to find the right feel. The first batch dragged, the second slumped, the third held to the wall, accepted the steel and closed over the brown coat with a modest sheen that dulled as it dried. She feathered the edges into the surrounding plaster, leaving the repair visible only to someone who knew where to look. She wanted it visible to herself. The wall had not become new. It had been answered. When the last patch firmed, she stood with the trowel in her hand and spoke the sentence softly into the stove-warmed room. "These patches will hold another 100 years." The words did not sound proud. They sounded like a promise made to lime, hair, lath, and whoever would touch that wall long after her own hands were gone. Doris Bell owned the diner on Rogers Street, though the painted sign in the window still read Bell's Lunch, because her father had named it in 1958, and Doris saw no virtue in repainting a thing that continued to tell the truth. She was a square woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair cut at her jaw, forearms strong from lifting coffee urns, and a habit of wearing pencil stubs behind both ears, though she could only use one at a time. Her aprons were always clean at dawn and marked with flour by noon. The first paper bag appeared outside the loft door on a Tuesday morning, folded twice at the top and weighted with a can of tomatoes. Inside were heel ends of bread, 2 boiled eggs, an apple with a bruise cut out, and a container of fish chowder gone thick overnight. Isla carried the bag downstairs, crossed to the diner and set it on the counter. "I cannot pay for this." Doris did not look up from slicing onions. "Nobody asked you to pay." "I cannot take it. You already carried it here." "That is taking it twice." "I mean it." "So do I." Doris scraped onions into a pan. "You can settle up in candles when the shop reopens." "The shop is not reopening. Then I will have to wait. The next week, another bag came, then another. Doris never mentioned them when Isla entered the diner to warm her hands around one lawful cup of coffee. She spoke instead about weather, about the price of haddock, about a nephew in Maine who had married too young and learned too slowly, about the way tourists thought fog was romantic until it delayed a boat. She did not ask about Graham or the company, or why a young woman with educated hands had ended up above a dead fish market. Doris had the rare courtesy of letting a person become familiar before becoming known. Once, when Isla tried again to refuse the bags, Doris set down her knife and leaned both hands on the counter. "Listen to me," she said. "My mother fed half the harbour in bad winters and wrote down maybe a third of it. Men came back years later with cash, or fish, or a fixed hinge, or nothing but shame on their faces. She took whatever they brought and did not spit on what they could not. You do the same when your turn comes." "My turn for what?" Doris returned to the onions. "You will know. Caleb Pike was Emmett's grandson, though he introduced himself by appearing in the alley with a red Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul strapped across the handlebars, and a face still growing into its bones. He was 16, tall in the unfinished way of boys who have not yet learned where their shoulders end, with sandy hair that fell into his eyes and a solemnity that made him seem younger when he tried to look grown. "My mother said," he began, then stopped. "Isla was scraping paint from the stair rail." "Said what?" "About your grandfather." "My great-uncle." "About him." Caleb looked embarrassed by the correction, and more embarrassed by his purpose. "She said he made my grandmother a ship in a cough syrup bottle after my grandfather drowned, so she could keep one boat that came home." The alley went hushed around that sentence. Even the gulls seemed elsewhere. Caleb lifted the maul from the bicycle. "I can split wood." "I cannot pay you." "My mother said." "That does not answer. She said not to take money." He dragged a crate of scrapboards from beneath the stairs, sorted the rotten from the dry, and began splitting kindling with a care that suggested Emmett's teaching had skipped no generation. His first pile leaned. He rebuilt it without being told. The second stood square against the wall under the stair, protected by a scrap of roofing felt. He came twice a week after school, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He said little, but he noticed what needed doing. A bucket carried up, a frozen spigot thawed with warm cloth, a bundle of old newspapers brought from home. He held boards steady while Isla cut them. He learned to set glazing points. He once spent an entire afternoon sorting bent nails from usable ones, lining them in ranks on the workbench as if they were soldiers awaiting orders. When Isla offered him the pocket watch to examine, he held it with reverence and handed it back too quickly. "Too fine for me." "No," she said. "Too trusted, maybe. Not too fine." His face reddened to the ears. Reverend Boyd appeared most mornings at nearly the same hour, walking down the lane from a white clapboard church 3 blocks inland. He was tall and thin, with a black overcoat shiny at the cuffs, a brimmed hat darkened by weather, and spectacles that slipped down his nose whenever he looked toward the harbour. He did not come to the loft door. He did not ask whether Isla had found a congregation, a doctrine, a reason, or a wound he could name. He simply walked past, paused beneath the stairs, tipped his hat toward the upper landing, and continued toward the wharf. The first time, Isla thought he had mistaken her for someone else. The second, she nodded back from the door. The third, he spoke without looking up. "Mercy keep you steady." 4 words. No sermon followed. His prayer became part of the morning weather. Some days she heard it while sweeping plaster dust, some days while warming putty, some days while sitting with her hands wrapped around the first coffee of the morning, too tired to answer aloud. He never seemed offended by silence. He offered the words as one might place a stone in a wall where a gap had appeared. In March, when the alley ice softened and the stairs no longer threatened to glaze over by afternoon, Reverend Boyd stopped with a paper envelope in his gloved hand. Isla came down to the second landing. Records office at the church, he said. Ada thought you might want copies. Inside were photocopied pages from burial records, marriage ledgers, and one brittle parish note mentioning Abigail Vane Marden by name. The copies were poor, dark at the edges, but readable. Thomas, Eliza, Samuel, Daniel, dates that matched the letter. Ground beneath names. Names beneath ground. Thank you, Isla said. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat. Mercy keep you steady. Then he walked on. The cellar had been postponed until February 11th because every other part of the building seemed more urgent and because the door to it had swollen in its frame so badly that opening it felt like beginning a quarrel with the foundation itself. It was not inside the loft but beneath the rear of the fish market, reached by an exterior bulkhead half hidden under a sheet of rusted tin and a tangle of dead vines near the walnut trees. Harold told her to wait until a dry week. Emmett told her to tie the bulkhead door open so it could not fall and break her neck. Doris told Caleb he was not to go down first, which made the boy arrive early and stand beside the door pretending he had not intended exactly that. They lifted the tin sheet together. The bulkhead doors were grey, swollen and streaked black with mildew. One hinge moved, one did not. Isla worked oil into the hinge pin for 2 days. Tapped it with a hammer, waited, tapped again and finally felt it give. When the doors opened, the smell that rose was cold stone, earth, old salt and air that had not been invited out for years. There were 7 granite steps descending into the dark, each worn at the centre by generations of feet. Caleb held a lantern at the top while Isla went down first, one hand on the wall, one foot testing every tread before trusting it. The cellar measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Low-ceilinged, its walls built of fieldstone chinked with lime. The floor was not dirt, as she had expected, but fitted stone, damp in places, sound in others. Along the left wall stood 2 empty fish barrels. Their iron hoops rusted thin. On the right, a shelf had collapsed under jars turned opaque with age. At the centre of the floor lay a single-dressed granite slab unlike the rest. It was rectangular, smooth-edged and set flush among rougher stones. On its face near one corner, someone had carved the tiny V mark, the same craft sign that appeared on the awl, the wax seal and the black glass bottle. Caleb leaned over the stair rail behind her. Are you going to lift it? No. Why not? Because some doors are not next. He considered this with the seriousness of a boy who wanted very much to be useful and was learning that restraint could be a form of use. The slab remained where it was. Isla swept around it, cleared broken glass, checked the walls for active water, and found only one seam weeping near the harbour side. Harold would have an opinion about that. Harold had opinions stored like nails. On the way back up, her boot struck the 3rd step from the top and made a different sound. Not hollow exactly. Interrupted, she crouched, brushed dirt from the riser, and found a narrow gap beneath the overhang where a wedge of oak had been driven in and darkened to nearly the colour of stone. Caleb's lantern beam trembled. Should I get Mr. Kettle? Not yet. She used the rosewood awl, not for force, but to clear packed dirt from around the wedge. The oak piece loosened after 10 minutes, then slid forward half an inch. Behind it, wedged under the step where no casual eye would search, was a compact oak box wrapped in oilcloth. It came free with a sigh of grit. They carried it upstairs before opening it. Some discoveries belonged in light. On the workbench, Isla unwrapped the oilcloth and found a box no larger than a loaf of bread. Pegged at the corners, its lid held by a brass hook. Inside lay 2 objects cushioned in wool, a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was heavy, older than the loft lock. with a long plain shaft and a bow shaped not as a circle but as the V-craft mark. 2 arms open like a pair of dividers. Its surface had darkened almost brown, except where the wool had rubbed it at the edges. No tag, no note, no lock named. The photograph had blackened at the corners but remained clear at the centre. It showed a young woman standing in front of the same building, though the clapboard behind her was bright and the sign below freshly painted. Her hair was pinned beneath a straw hat. Her dress was dark, work plain, sleeves rolled to the forearm. In one hand she held a miniature mast with rigging threads trailing down like fine rain. In the other she held a bottle by its neck. The face made Caleb whisper one word he immediately regretted. "Looks." He stopped. Isla finished it only in her own silence. The young woman in the photograph had her cheekbones, her straight mouth, the same watchful set around the eyes. Though the world had not yet put the same shadows beneath them, she was not identical. Blood does not photocopy, but resemblance stood there plainly, in silver and black, in front of the very wall where Isla now slept above the harbour. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in brown ink faded at the descenders, was written, Abigail Vane, daughter of Thomas Vane, age 25, summer of 1903. Caleb looked at the workbench, then at Isla, then at the floor, choosing, with uncommon grace, not to speak. The brass key she placed on the mantel beside the stove, where it caught the firelight and kept its own counsel. She did not know what it opened. Not the cellar slab. Not the loft door. Not the tin box. The key had waited under the 3rd step for reasons that belonged to a later hour. That night, while the stove warmed the new plaster and wind pushed against the repaired windows, Isla looked at the photograph until the young woman in it ceased to be a likeness and became a person. Abigail at 25, before the telegram, before the influenza week, before the long silence of the upper room, standing with a tool of the trade in her hand, not smiling, not performing, simply present. Isla set the tintype beside the letter, and the room accepted it without sound. Spring did not arrive as a declaration, it came by subtraction. Snow retreated first from the edges of the alley, then from the sunny side of the stair rail, then from the walnut roots where black earth showed in crescent shapes. Ice left the spigot handle. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with snowmelt and ran brown under the culvert along the harbour. Ropes softened, nets thawed, and gulls returned to their louder arguments with renewed authority. By late March, walnut catkins hung from the branches like greenish tassels, and the horseshoe tree took on a faint haze at its tips. The chickadee returned more than once to the repaired window, tapping at the glass as if annoyed by its own reflection. In the mornings, light entered the workroom earlier and stayed with a different colour, less pewter, more linen. The loft had not become finished. Finished was a word for catalogues and houses prepared for sale. The stair still needed scraping. The market below remained boarded. The cellar seam wept in heavy rain. The front room held more tools than furniture. But the room could keep heat, shed rain, hold light, and allow sleep without demanding that Isla first negotiate with fear. That was enough for one winter. She did not begin the bottle ship craft that spring, not in earnest. The black glass galleon remained sealed on the high bench, and the bank instructions remained folded with the papers, protected but untouched by haste. She had learned enough from Abigail's letter to know that beginning poorly would be another way of wasting what had been kept. Instead, she ordered small materials with 1 coin exchanged carefully through Harold, who inspected the dealer's catalogue as if protecting her from thieves, foolishness, and inflated shipping charges in equal measure. Pearwood strips, linen thread, a packet of glass practice bottles with wide mouths before she dared narrow ones, new beeswax, hide glue, a cheap thermometer for glue water, sandpaper in fine grits, a ledger of her own. She practiced on samples, 1 mast shaved from scrap until it stood straight, 1 rigging ladder tied between pins, 1 sail starched, dried underweight, and discarded because the edge curled, 1 cork sea painted too blue, then scraped clean. One hinge so crude that it made her laugh once, quietly, because failure on a sample was honest and almost kind. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Isla completed her first true bottle ship in the loft above the old fish market, though she did not call it true until it had survived 3 days on the bench without a line slackening. Outside, the harbour was under a low sky, and snow moved sideways past the repaired windows in fine white grains. Inside, the stove held a bed of coals, the bayberry candle stump rested in its scallop holder, and the room smelled of beeswax, pine, lamp oil, and the clean metallic tang of tools, wiped after use. The ship was not large. It sat inside a clear apothecary bottle she had found at a salvage shop in Ipswich, its glass faintly green at the shoulder and uneven enough to bend the masts if viewed from the side. The hull was pearwood, no longer than her thumb, painted black above a narrow ochre line. 3 masts rose in proper order. The sails were cream linen, lightly starched, each reef point pricked with a needle and pulled through with thread so fine she had to breathe away from it. The rigging was not perfect. She knew every place where a knot sat larger than it should, and one place near the mizzen where the line would have been cleaner if drawn before the foremast lifted. But the ship stood. It had entered folded, risen slowly, accepted its bottle, and kept its shape. She set it on the sill beside 2 practice pieces, then stepped back and looked only once. Silas would have turned it toward the light and nodded. Abigail might have taken a knife to one line and made it better. Her father would have asked how the hull behaved under proportion. Isla let all of them remain as they were in memory, and did not demand applause from the room. The restored interior had become modest and exact. The front room held a narrow counter made from reclaimed pine, sanded but not stripped of its scars. Behind it, shallow shelves displayed bottles in different stages of making. Empty glass washed clear hull blanks, folded masts, finished practice ships, and 3 completed pieces ready for sale by appointment only. The pot-bellied stove stood blacked and steady near the chimney, with a brass kettle on top and a tin tray beneath for kindling. The floorboards glowed deep honey where winter light touched them. The repaired plaster carried faint trowel marks near the stove, visible only in slant light. The workroom remained a working room, not a museum. Tools laid out, thread labelled, glue pot cleaned, magnifier angled over the bench, notebook open to measurements written in Isla's small upright hand. The black glass galleon had been opened in the 2nd autumn. After 6 months of practice on failed sleeves and pin mechanisms, it had not broken. The cedar sleeve had lifted exactly as Abigail had written, and the rolled parchment inside had confirmed the bank instructions, the line of design custody, and the unaltered drawings that belonged to Elias. The legal work that followed moved slowly privately through a small Boston firm, descended from the name on the old document. There was no press release, no public victory. Graham Reed did not return to the story. His company, Isla heard once through a letter from an attorney, had settled certain claims without admission and retreated into language. That was enough. She did not feed any part of her life to him again. The brass key waited longer. It was Caleb who noticed the plate in the walnut tree, though he was no longer the boy who had first arrived with a splitting maul tied to his bicycle. By the 2nd winter, he drove an old pickup with 1 blue door and kept a carpenter's pencil behind his ear in unconscious imitation of Harold. He had come to help Isla clear storm-fallen branches after a nor'easter, and was standing by the horseshoe tree when he called up to her. "There is brass in this bark." Isla came down with her coat, half-buttoned. The visible iron horseshoe remained where it had always been, nearly swallowed by living wood. But on the inland side of the trunk, beneath a ridge of bark that had grown like a folded lip, a small rectangular edge caught the light. Not iron, brass. Greened by weather, almost hidden under lichen. They did not cut into the tree. Caleb used a soft brush and a wooden shim. Isla worked with the bone-handled knife, clearing only loose bark and dirt, never living tissue that resisted. Slowly, a plate appeared, no larger than a playing card, set into an old scar that the tree had grown around but not over. At its centre was a keyhole shaped like no modern lock. The brass key from the mantel entered stiffly. It turned. A narrow compartment opened in the trunk with such quiet precision that both of them stepped back. Inside was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. The tree had guarded it for decades inside a wound made before the bark closed. They carried the cylinder upstairs and opened it on the workbench beneath Abigail's photograph. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, small enough to have been carried. Its cotton faded but whole. Beside it was a note dated November 11th, 1931, written in Abigail's hand. This flag was sent home with my brother's effects after the armistice ceremonies. It was not the flag of a nation to me first, but the cloth last folded near a man who did not return to his bench. If you find it, do not wave it for pride. Lay it once where his name is kept, and then keep it dry. The living are poor guardians when they mistake honour for noise. Beneath the note was a second slip, naming Thomas Vane, 26th Division, and a burial record in Gloucester, where a family marker had received his name, though his body lay elsewhere among the war dead. The year was real. The war had been real. The silence that followed had been real. On November 11th, 2024, Isla carried the Spanish campaign medal and the folded flag to Beechbrook Cemetery in Gloucester, where the Vane family marker stood under two leaning maples near the older section. Reverend Boyd walked with her but did not lead the moment. Harold came in a wool coat and said nothing. Doris brought a small jar of sand from the harbour because, she said, men who worked near water ought to have some near them. Caleb stood behind Isla, hat in hand. The cemetery grass was brown, and the air carried the first hard promise of winter. Isla laid the medal at the base of the stone for 1 minute only, long enough to acknowledge the hand that had carried it and the person who had hidden it. Then she lifted it again, wrapped it in clean cloth, and placed the flag beside the marker while Reverend Boyd spoke 4 words into the cold. Mercy keeps the lost. Afterward, she returned both objects to the loft, not because the dead needed possessions, but because the living sometimes need entrusted things to remind them not to become careless. The money remained mostly unspent. 3 coins had gone into repair when winter made refusal foolish. 1 gold coin for roof materials that could not wait, 1 silver dollar for the first true order of pearwood and linen, and $1 half for legal copying fees when the Boston firm required more paper than any honest memory should need. Later, a 4th coin bought the glass for the front display case after Doris threatened to put the first finished bottles in her pie case beside lemon meringue. The rest returned to the tin box, counted, listed and sealed in a cedar drawer built beneath the workbench. Isla added to it when she could. Not often, not much. A $5 bill from the first sold ship, $2 from repairing a broken model schooner for a widower in Rockport, $17 from teaching a Saturday lesson to 3 women who wanted to make Christmas gifts with their own hands. She labelled the envelope not savings and not emergency. She wrote, for the next one. She still lived carefully, no new car, no bright renovation, no sudden transformation into a person who could afford to forget the price of beans. The legal settlement repaired her claim and paid certain debts, but she kept it mostly in accounts, watched by people whose names she knew and whose letters she answered slowly. Money was no longer weather every day. That was mercy enough. The shop reopened without a sign at first. Doris placed an index card on the corkboard beside the diner register. Bottle ships repaired and made by hand. Upstairs over Marden fish. Ask at counter. No rush work. The card was written in Doris's square hand, with 1 word underlined twice, hand. For 3 weeks no one asked. Then an old man brought in a bottle ship with a fallen mast. Then a woman from Manchester by the Sea came with a cracked family model wrapped in a towel. Then a teacher wanted to know whether Isla would speak to a class about patience and measurement. Isla said no to the class, then changed it to perhaps in spring, then wrote a 1-page note the teacher could read aloud instead. By the next winter, the mailing list held 43 names, written in a ledger beside addresses, repair notes and preferences. Some wanted finished ships, some wanted broken ones mended, Some only wanted to know when the workroom would be open for visitors on a Saturday afternoon. Isla kept the hours narrow: Thursday 10 to 2, Saturday by appointment. Winter fewer, summer still fewer when the harbour heat made glue behave badly. People came quietly. They climbed the repaired side stair, stood in the front room, and lowered their voices without being told. The loft did that to them. It did not impress. It settled. It asked the body to move with care. Caleb returned on a cold afternoon with a sign wrapped in a moving blanket and tied with twine. He had grown into his height by then, though his ears still reddened when praised. The sign was hand-carved from walnut windfall taken from the branch that had come down in the storm. He had planed it himself, carved the letters with Emmett's old gouges, and rubbed the surface with oil until the grain rose dark and deep. The words read, "Vane Daughters." Isla stood in the alley looking at it. There were no daughters after Abigail, Caleb said too quickly, misunderstanding her silence. I mean, not for the shop. But Doris said the plural mattered, and Reverend Boyd said Scripture was full of impossible plurals, and Grandpa said if the lettering was straight, nobody would complain. Harold, standing behind him, snorted. I said more than that. Doris had come out from the diner without her coat, arms folded against the cold. Reverend Boyd paused at the lane entrance with his hat in his hands. Emmett stood beside the truck, leaning on his cane and pretending not to care. Isla touched the carved ampersand. Caleb had shaped it like a loop of rope, crossing and returning into itself. Daughters, she said. Too much. She shook her head. The old sign below still read Marden Fish Provisions, tilted and rusted, and she did not remove it. That belonged to the building's lower life, to cod, ice, barrels, knives and men who had come through the market door before dawn. Caleb's sign went beside the loft stair, not replacing, but answering, Vane Daughters, not a claim that the line had been clean, not a lie that anyone had been properly handed what she deserved. A plural, large enough to include Abigail, Isla, unnamed careful hands, and whoever might one day climb those stairs with no place else to go. That evening, after everyone left, and the sign settled into the cold, Isla sat at the workbench with Abigail's letter open beside a blank sheet of cream paper. The stove made small ticking sounds. Snow tapped the front windows. The brass key lay on the mantel. The black glass galleon, now empty of its hidden roll but still whole, stood beneath the shelf where it had waited through decades of dust. Isla sharpened a pencil first, then chose ink. Pencil could be erased too easily, and some promises needed the dignity of risk. She wrote the date carefully. Then she paused, looking at her hand, at the faint scars along her knuckles, at the small burn near her wrist from the glue pot, at the half-moon mark where a glazing point had slipped. She began with the same words. My dear one, whoever you are. The sentence entered the paper and did not belong only to her. She did not finish the letter that night. It would take more than one evening to say what needed saying without ornament. She would have to write about the loft, about the account, about the tools, about the legal papers, about the cedar drawer. She would have to explain what to repair first and what not to touch. She would have to name Doris, Harold, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, Ada, Mrs. Keene, and the unnamed diner kindness in Peabody, because inheritance was not a line, but a net, and nets held only when many knots did their modest work. Near midnight, she capped the ink and placed the unfinished letter beneath a clean board so it would dry flat. Then she banked the stove, checked the door bar, and stood for a moment in the front room. The harbour lights trembled through wavy glass. Below, the former fish market slept in its salt-stained boards. Above, the loft held tools, letters, coins, drawings, and one new ship on the sill, its tiny sails raised inside a narrow bottle by patient threads. The loft above the fish market waits. It has always waited. The house had been waiting, and now she had begun to wait with it. In Ada Merrow's desk at the county office, the 4 worn dollar bills remained in the back of the shallow drawer where she had placed them after recording the deed. She had not spent them. She had clipped them together with Isla's receipt copy and a note written in her own careful hand, paid in full and then some. On certain winter afternoons, when the office grew dim and the radiator hissed beneath the window, Ada would open the drawer, look once at the bills and close it again without speaking. Some payments are not meant to leave the place where they became proof,